Welcome back, guys. We are now going to start a new story, Super Science, written by Thatchickendude. You can find his profile link in the description. Ch1, a new purpose. This was the end. At least, that's what Izuku thought as he looked over the side of the bridge he was on. Today was the day he'd finally end it all. He has thought about this for a while, but says that there was nothing else. He had no other avenue or backup plans. He gave it his all, honestly. That is the one good thing he could say for himself. But no more. The words off all around him, his best friend and even his idol, all ripped every last shred of self-drive he had left. All it would take was one final step, but something grabbed his hand before he could. He turned around and saw a man who was red in the face, breathing heavily, and standing on shaky legs. It was apparent he was in a hurry to get somewhere. A cluster of papers was in his hands, but that detail didn't matter as he heard the man speak. "Why, young man, wait," he said breathlessly. "Don't do it," he pleaded. Izuku ripped his hand away and snapped, "Why not? What's the point? I have no reason to go on anymore. I have no purpose." "Then let me give you a new one," the man exclaimed. Izuku looked at the man, nearing the verge of tears. He softly asked, "What?" "Just answer me this," he told him while collecting the paper in his other hand. Holding the papers out, he asked, "Did you write these?" Izuku looked at the papers and saw that they were the remains of his old hero analysis notebook. He remembered when he was on top of a building and tearing out sheet after sheet, letting them fly off into the wind. He was also reminded that it was one of the many times he tried to end it but chickened out before finally finishing the deed on this bridge. At least then, his body wouldn't be found, just forgotten like he wanted. "Why? How?" Izuku stammered out. "I saw you when you were letting them fly free. It took a day, but I got them all. Then, spend the rest of that time trying to find you. And I'm glad I did," he explained. Izuku said nothing as he dropped the stack, prompting the man to retrieve them quickly. Izuku turned around and told him, "You should just forget about them. They're worthless," he said the last part with a shudder. The man looked at him incredulously and stated, "Worthless? What are you talking about?" "These are amazing." Izuku felt a shiver of pride run up his spine as the man continued his praise. "Never in my whole life have I ever seen a more amazing talent. Such intricacy, such detail, such passion. You have a truly unique gift, quirk or no quirk," he said with the kindest tone ever given to him. Izuku looked at him with shock and asked, "How did you dash?" The man then stood on the bridge with him before sitting down and letting his legs dangle as he told him, "I kinda figured it out. A lot of suicides are from the quirkless. You must have been through a lot." Izuku didn't sit beside him. Instead, he squatted and hugged his knees, asking, "Why do you care? I'm just some nobody." The man looked at him again like he was crazy and ranted, "Nobody? Nobody? Young man, you have a gift for detail and analysis on a level that's even better than most valedictorians. You have something greater than any quirk in the world. A sharp mind. And being able to think is better than being able to punch," he told him while poking his head. Izuku felt his smothered emotions break free as he admitted, "All my life, I've always wanted to be a hero. I figured," the man said softly. "But everyone told me I couldn't, that I was weak. But I didn't care if I had a quirk or if it was strong. Heck, I didn't even care about being a popular hero. I just wanted to help people with a smile on my face," he told him, pouring his guts out in thick tears before sniffling back and saying, Like All Might," the man finished, making Izuku look at him. The man gave a small chuckle and told him, "Yeah, I idolized him when I was younger." The man then leans back and looks up, telling Izuku, "You know, you and I aren't too different. I have a dream people say is impossible, and I started believing them." Izuku looked away, wanting to bury his head in his arms, thinking he knew where this conversation would lead. That is until the man followed up, saying, "Until I put in my blood, sweat, and tears into my dream, and I finally made something. Something I know will change the world." Izuku was now on his butt as he saw the man's fists tighten. Looking at him with a mix of determination and desperation, he admitted, "But I need help." "Your help?" "Me?" Izuku asked while pointing at himself. "You say you're hopeless and in the pits of despair without any other purpose in life?" The man asked Izuku while grabbing his shoulders and looking him dead in the eyes. "Then, let me give you one. You may not have power, but you have brains. And that's the thing that brought us to where we are as a species." He told him seriously before pulling away and bowing to him. He begged, "So please, young man, become my assistant." Izuku was silent for a long while, which made the man worry he'd deny or jump. But Izuku did neither, he just sat and thought. After a long thought, he let one single tear run down his face as he replied, "Being a hero was a long shot. I knew it wouldn't work, but I wanted to give it my all." He then looked at the man and confidently stated, "I accept." Ch2, the labo. After accepting his proposal, Izuku was led off the bridge towards the town. Nobody once bats an eye towards them, even when on the edge. The man walked close beside Izuku, almost as if trying to protect him or keep an eye on him. While the two of them walked in comfortable silence, Izuku took a close look at his features. He was older than himself but younger than his mother, so maybe 30 or so. He was tall and thin as a twig, especially his legs. He was nearly an entire torso taller, and he wasn't very short himself. His hair was messy, matted, and sandy blonde. It made his hair look tame by comparison. His eyes were an unusual pale color, making him appear blind, and thick glasses framed his patchy, freckled face. He wore a white lab coat, blue jeans, and green shoes that looked much like his red ones. A name tag on his chest read, "Hello, my name is Professor Egon Cristallo." After taking this all in, Izuku took a deep breath, which made the professor quiver like an animal getting ready to move, and emptied his mind. He allowed himself to go into autopilot and walk with him. After walking for a long time, they eventually made it to the more suburban area of town. When Izuku's mind came back from La La Land, he was in front of a modern yet sizable suburban home. After looking over the house, he turned to his walking companion and asked, "So, this is your lab?" "It's my house, but yes," Egon replied. Izuku's face deflated at this response, and he replied in an apologetic tone, "I'm sorry, sir, but I was expecting more." Egon asked as Izuku turned away, trying not to show his disappointment. "I understand. The truth is, I was kicked out of my old job for being too persistent in the pursuit of something unrealistic," he said in a mocking tone with air quotes. "You're unemployed?" Izuku tried his best not to sound shocked. "Yes," he answered honestly, only to backtrack, seeing Izuku's expressions and body language, looking ready to bolt. "But trust me, I have a plan. As I said, I need your help and your mind," he told him while poking his forehead. Izuku gulped and asked, "So, what was this dream you were chasing?" Egon giggles like an excited schoolgirl and waves for him to follow, saying, "I'll show you." Curiosity grabbed his mind as he followed the man into his home. After unlocking the door and letting him in, he saw a quaint yet very messy and somewhat smelly house with a cat. After being led through stacks of paperwork, old takeout and pizza boxes, and many corkboards filled with notes, he was brought to a room lined with some kind of radiation-resistant metal and was sitting in the center, covered up in a sheet. Grabbing the sheets, he looked at Izuku excitedly before ripping it off and proclaiming, "Behold." "What exactly am I beholding?" Izuku asked while looking at a large, very strange-looking white glowing crystal. "I call it the singularity soul. Life force energy runs through every aspect of this crystal. Creation and evolution are at our fingertips. At least that's my working theory," Egon told him fiercely. "Is that really what it does? What else can it do?" Izuku asked with amazement and wonder, getting closer to the crystal. "I have no idea. I was always so busy with my work that I rarely had time to work on it. But that's where you come in," Egon admitted with a shrug, making Izuku fall to the ground from his previous statement on it. I need to figure out what it can and can't do. That's where you come in, he told him while poking his chest. Izuku took a more serious demeanor and stepped back, saying, "Before I commit fully to this, I have 2 questions. Question 1. How are you supporting yourself without a job? My parents died some time ago and left me a fat inheritance. I didn't start using it until a few weeks ago. But it won't last long, and at the rate I'm going, I probably only have enough to get by for a year at the most," he admitted while rubbing the back of his head. "Sorry about your parents," Izuku told him, feeling ashamed to ask, only to get away from Egon. Second question, how did you come up with the theory that this thing is crystallized God? He followed up. Well, it has to do with my quirk, he explained while rolling up his sleeve and producing a transparent crystal from his palm. It's called crystallized manufacturing. I can create any crystals I want to. The only problem is I've never practiced much with it or studied the structure and chemical compounds of crystals, so I can only create one type. But that's all I need for it, he explained before breaking off the crystal and putting it against the singularity soul, saying, "Observe." Within a few seconds, the white light emitted from the singularity soul seemed to pass from it and into the clear crystal, turning it into the same soft, glowing white. Egon pulled it away and placed it in Izuku's hands. Looking over the crystal with wonder and awe, he could only say, "Wow." Now the power of the singularity soul is in this crystal and holds all of its properties. As such, I have named these soul splinters, or splinters for short, Egon proudly told him. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind, and Izuku asked worriedly, "Wait, won't it run out if you keep doing that?" I thought the same, but I'm fairly certain this is limitless. He then turned to a closet door and, just before opening it, said, "Come and look at this." Izuku looked into the now open door and saw it was a nicely sized walk-in closet lined with the same metallic material as the room with the singularity soul. However, lining every available space in the room was an enormous number of splinters like the one Egon had just made. Holy! Wow! Izuku said in awe as he stepped into the room lit up by the many splinters stored inside. Turning back to the professor, he asked, "How many are in here?" "Told you it was limitless," Egon chuckled. Izuku liked his lips, his mind racing with thoughts and decisions until he finally reached a consensus. He knew that being a hero at this point was hopeless. He had given up on that to the point of wanting to take his own life. So, what other choices did he have? Nothing. But now, the winds of fate had blown in a different direction, and here he was. He smiled, looked up at the man, and asked, "When do we start?" Egon smiled, snapped his fingers, and exclaimed, "I like your enthusiasm. Tomorrow, here at my place, after you're out of school." At that moment, Egon saw Izuku's face turn from elation to doubt and finally hopelessness. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I just remembered. I have school work and tests to do." Izuku grumbled, knowing that school, even with time management, would eat up most of it. Egon thought. He looked at the boy's uniform and asked, "You go to Aldera High, right?" Izuku nodded and waved a finger, saying, "Wait right here." Izuku did as he said and only had to wait for a few minutes before Egon returned with a plastic bin and plopped it at his feet, saying, "Okay, here you go. Use this to help with time restraints." Izuku opened the tub and saw it was filled to the brim with papers. He took the first one on the top and instantly recognized it. "Wait, I know this test. We just took it today," he exclaimed before realizing and asking, "Wait, is this Dash?" Egon nods and tells him, "Yep. I used to attend Aldera. And before you say anything, of course, it'll work. They never change the curriculum. Ever. Isn't this? You know. Cheating?" Izuku asked nervously while fidgeting with himself. Even shrugged and offered, "Maybe. But it's not like they ever gave you a chance, did they?" Izuku gripped the paper hard and looked away with a deep scowl forming. "So use it to coast through everything to get a passing grade so you can spend more time working on the Singularity project with me," he told him with a smile. Izuku's lips quiver, and before he could start bawling, he bows profoundly and yells, "Thank you so much." When he waves it off and pulls him up, he tells him, "Don't mention it. Now get home and rest up. You've got a busy day ahead of you." Ch3, the first fine several weeks had passed since Izuku started working with Egon on the Singularity Soul. It was strange at first, to say the least. Izuku was wary of Egon for a long while when he started. He was strange, to say the least. He would jump at the most insignificant things, change his tone and mannerisms severely depending on the situation, and at the drop of a hat. The way he spoke, often stuttering or just talking so low, made it look like he was just mouthing words, looking off into space with a glazed expression, his reasoning for doing certain things. He was overworking himself, overcarrying things to the point it was comical, and so much more. Then, one day, Izuku realized something. This is how other people perceived him all the time. With that revelation made, Izuku became much more at ease with him. Despite what seemed like the madness of trying to juggle school and research, he eventually came into a rhythm. He'd get up, change, eat, say goodbye to his mom, and head out. After school, he'd head to Egon's home and go through the tub of paper to pick out what he needed for homework or answers to a test he'd have to copy down. After this, he'd enter his designated office space and begin experimenting. After several hours of research and experimentation, he'd go home, eat, bathe, and go to sleep. "Hey, Izuku. Wow. You sure are focused. Have you found anything yet?" Egon asked as he walked into Izuku's office, coffee mug in hand. He saw Izuku looking through a microscope and then skimming his computer before writing something down. He answered without looking up from the device, "I'm just looking over its structure and chemical compounds to cross-reference anything that matches up." "How is that going?" Egon prompted him while looking at his notes, which were just about chicken scratch. Izuku sighs dejectedly and tells him, "Not well. It doesn't match up with anything. At least on Earth." "I had a feeling it might be alien," Egon said with a chuckle while taking a drink. Then a stray thought crossed his mind, and he turned around to ask, "Where'd you find this anyway?" Egon looked serious and put the mug down, two things that were never a good sign. Then he interlaced his finger while putting his thumb under his chin and finger over his nose, yet again another bad sign, and Izuku knew he was in for a ridiculous story. Well, back at the laboratory, a small group was sent out on an investigative dig site from a crashed meteor, myself amongst them. Anyhow, I unearthed the crystal in a completely different site, far away from the meteor crash site. They told me it was just a really big crystal formation but allowed me to take it back anyway, he explained while forcing a smile. Izuku looked at him, then at the crystal fragment he had under the microscope, then back at Egon, where he asked, "So how'd you manage to get it back here?" "I kinda stole it," Egon admitted while twiddling his fingertips. Izuku blinked, then his face fell as he replied, "I don't know what I was expecting. I'll run some tests on it and get back to you on my findings." Then, one day, Izuku stormed into Egon's office, causing the man to spit his coffee and knock over stacks of paper as he typed on his computer. Running up to him frenetically, he began his absolute nonsense spree. Sir, Izuku yelled while barging in. What, Egon answers while trying to calm himself from the shock. Crystal. Yes. It did. Okay, enough of the SpongeBob references. Just tell me what happened, Egon told him firmly while grabbing his shoulders. Okay, so I was running several splinters through several different tests, and I finally found something that the energy source inside is capable of, Izuku quickly and breathlessly explained. Egon then sat back in his chair, straightened himself and his coat, crossed his legs, and stated, "Okay, start from the beginning and leave nothing out." Izuku nodded and explained, "So first, I took several of the crystals and placed them into jars completely submerged in several different substrates, BLD, urine, sweat, saliva, tears, and..." He dropped off. "And," Egon prompted him. "SMN, Izuku admits with a cough. Egon blinks at him before sighing and shaking his head. Maybe I shouldn't have asked for the details, but go on. After a couple of days of soaking, I found out that almost no change had been made to them, so I decided to take them out and try out some other working theories. Except I forgot about the one that was still in the BLD. When I finally realized and pulled it out, it had changed color from a pale glowing white to a crimson red. After cleaning it off, I felt some sort of strange connection to the crystal as I was holding it, almost like it was a SWCH inside my head. And when I turned it on, the crystal began to leak BLD, Izuku told him with excitement, building in every word and making Egon grow more and more intrigued. So I decided to let it drain out into a jar, thinking it absorbed the BLD inside, but after a while, I found out that wasn't the case. Instead of just expelling all the BLD, it continually kept making more and more. When I retrieved the crystal, I felt the same connection again and flipped the SWCH off, and the crystal stopped producing the BLD. Egon's eyes widened at this revelation but didn't say anything till he was done. So I decided to do the same thing, but this time, I put several into different jars filled with medicine, liquid aspirin, hydrogen peroxide, burn cream, and alcohol, among a few others. Anyhow, the same thing happened after leaving it inside of those medicines to soak for about 5 days, like the BLD crystal. I was able to turn them on, and they produced all the substance in consistent amounts with no signs of running out, Izuku exclaimed with his arms in the air, pure zeal taking over every word. Incredible, Egon jumped up from his chair before being struck with a thought and asking, did you try to make the BLD splinter absorb anything else? Izuku nods and tells him, I did, but nothing. I also found the splinters to be very fragile, and if broken, they stop producing the substance. Egon raised an eyebrow at this and stated, fragile. I have a hard time breaking these things when I make them, even with the energy inside of them. I guess they become more brittle when they absorb something, Izuku guessed with a shrug. Did you find anything else? Egon asks again. Izuku nods and takes out a clipboard. After flipping a few pages, he says, yes, I've tested a few with other states of matter. For solids, no results, no matter what I try. It works for gases as long as there are no other air particles in the homemade vacuum chamber I made. As for plasma, the only thing I could think of doing was to try to conduct it to a power source directly, and now it generates its power signal. Egon blinks before exclaiming, you caught lightning in a bottle. Izuku looks off to the side and makes an uncomfortable expression before replying, I guess. But I would like to try that one day. Currently, it's just enough to power a few appliances, and any more will shatter. Izuku. These are. Egon suddenly said, his expression and face growing dark, making Izuku shudder and resend on edge. All before he exploded into a smile, he grabbed the boy and hugged him while saying, amazing. I can't believe you discovered so much in just a few weeks. It would take university students and professors months, if not years, to do what you've done and make results. You should be proud. Izuku couldn't help but smile back as a king of pride and joy swelled up in him. Once he was let down, he told the professor, there is one other thing. Egon raised an eyebrow at this, letting him continue. When I was in close proximity to one of the splinters, without anything absorbed into it, I found myself far less fatigued than what I do when I'm not. So after putting it through your radiation detector, I found it gave off a sort of harmless radiation, Izuku explained. Egon placed his fist into his palm and stated like a revelation, I have been wondering why in the world you seem to be so full of energy all the time despite the work effort you put in. Having said that, I don't want you to abuse it. Who knows what could happen with long-term exposure, Izuku nods in agreement as Egon backs away from his previous scolding mannerisms. On the offhand, with a bit of tweaking, we could go completely off the grid. And on the other, he draws out while thinking of to the side and telling him, I think our money situation has just been solved. How so? Izuku questions. Egon sits back in his chair and thinks a bit more before coming to a consensus and telling the teen, I'm going to use most of my resources to get some medical drags and other such things. Izuku, I want you to make splinters for each one. After that, we're going to go dumpster diving and get into contact with as many hospitals and medical providers as possible in Masutafu. Izuku nods rapidly and states, I'll do my best. For big money. A couple of weeks later, the two scientists set out to do what they had said. With Egon's connections, he was able to acquire medical-level drugs and other medications alongside many different types. Once they had it, Izuku set to work, ensuring each other would be copied into an individual splinter. The whole process would take 5 days, so they set off on their other chore. Going down to a beach covered in junk, the two of them rented a pickup truck and spent the next 5 days taking plastic water cooler jugs back to Egon's house, washing them out, and then returning to do it all again. They even managed to find a huge fish aquarium in near-perfect condition. After having all these empty containers, they set to work on the most tedious part. They filled each container with a different medicine. It was hard for them to figure out when they were filled, even when away, so they made a sensor that would go off to a wireless alarm when they weren't home or paying attention. They even took the time to experiment with one of the splinters, making it fill over a dozen water cooler jugs and the fish tank. And to their surprise, it did just that without any signs of stopping. While the filling process was happening, Egon went around calling every hospital that would listen to come to a showing at a theater that he rented out. A few weeks went by, and everything was finally set up. Egon stood behind the stage with a mix on his ear and nodded to Izuku, who was on the other side of the stage. They had practiced this situation for days on end, and now they were ready to sell their new miracle product. And hopefully, they would bite. Egon walked out from the curtain, and the theater grew quiet as he addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the CEOs and managers of many medical facilities for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come today. He complimented them, and they gave him a round of applause in return. He raised his hand, and the clapping stopped. Once they all went quiet, he said, Now I bet you're wondering why you should even give me 2 more seconds of your time to ask you to come out here. Well, I'm glad you think that. Because I have a little something I'm sure all of you will want to clamber over each other to get. What is that, you may ask? I'll show you. He then reaches into his lab coat pocket and pulls out a splinter that was colored off-white, proclaiming, Behold! The splinter. There was no reaction from the crowd, just confusion. So he continued telling them, This small crystal, made with my quirk and infused with a special energy source, is capable of recreating any liquid or gas-based substance after prolonged exposure. This one, in particular, contains a mixture of lidocaine, bupivacaine, mepivacaine, and nitrous oxide or, as I'm sure most of you know it, anesthetic gas in liquid form. At the sound of this, the whole crowd broke out into loud conversations amongst one another and to the professor, who had to calm them down, telling them, People, please, no questions until after the showcase, and I'm pretty sure I'm about to answer all your questions and concerns. First off, a demonstration. The splinter needs a mental command when in physical contact to activate it. Doing so will cause the splinter to leak out its content. To show what he meant, he took a glass beaker from his pocket, turned on the splinter, and placed it inside when it started leaking. He left it to sit in his hand, holding it out for the crowd to see, and they all watched it with massive intrigue. After a few minutes, the beaker was completely submerged in the liquid. Egon then took out the splinter and turned it off while placing the beaker on the ground and telling the crowd, As you can see, the splinter has filled this cup in a short time. A few mutterings went around, but Egon continued, saying, Now I'm sure you are all thinking that it will run out, correct? Well, allow me to put your minds at ease. This particular splinter has been put through extensive experiments, and we have come to show what has been produced consistently over a PRD of 2 weeks. Egon clapped his hand, and Izuku started to bring out small push carts with water cooler jugs filled with the same fluid in the cup on the floor. Izuku kept going back and forth, bringing out jug after jug until he took a few minutes to bring out the fish and fill it to the top with the same fluid. At this sight, the crowd once again exploded into talking and excitement. Some were even trying to offer money. But Egon stopped their jabbering and explained, However, I must warn you that they are extremely fragile. Observe. With that, he dropped the splinter in his hand, and the crystal shattered on contact with the floor, breaking into so many that it looked like bits of crushed ice about to melt. This makes the crowd become discouraged by the product. Some were even now skeptical. However, Egon once again put their minds at ease with another demonstration. And for those of you who are still unsure if what I just brought out was the real deal, perhaps a demonstration. He then clapped his hands, and Izuku brought out a hospital gurney with a man that looked like a pig lying on it with his back supported up so he could see and be seen. Next to him was a heart and brain monitor. This is Mr. Wang. Mr. Wang was kind enough to volunteer for this showcase. He introduced the man while taking out a syringe and explaining, "I will now take the liquid from both the tanks and cup I just filled to demonstrate, using no more than 10 cubic centimeters of each." He then took a sample from each spot and injected it into the 4 injector on his arm. After a minute or so, Mr. Wang's eyes started to flutter and he passed out right in his seat. A slight murmur sounds around the auditorium. Egon motioned to the man and said, "As you can see from the monitor, Mr. Wang is completely under the effect of the anesthetics." But before any more commotions or explosions on deals could be made, Egon exclaimed, "And that's not all. I have splinter of all different kinds of medications and drags." He waved his hands, and after taking away the asleep man, Izuku brought out a rack full of splinters holding different medical medicines and drags. This left the crowd in awe and excitement. Now, as far as pricing. I'm sure you can all understand that such an item is bound to save any of you millions from ordering repeatedly. So, it will cost you around 20 years of what you would spend on that particular drag or medication. But think of it this way. He quickly filled up before the crowd could get cold feet, locking their attention. In the long term, you'll be making all that money back tenfold. He exclaimed, which seemed to grab their interest in the objects again. After seeing the crowd start to warm up and get hotter by the second, Egon put on his most friendly face and, in sweet words, asked, "So, what do you say?" Several hours later, Izuku and Egon sat at a table in Egon's office at his home, staring at the computer screen with Egon's bank account information. They were shocked and awed at what they saw after the selling event. Neither of them said a word for a long time, but eventually, Egon was the one to state the obvious, $50 million. $50 million. We just made $50 million. In one sitting from just a few dozen splinters and all those tubs of medicine. He exclaimed in zeal while jumping up and around in his chair. Well, people were offering more and more. It turned into an auction. Izuku stated, trying not to act like his mentor. "This is amazing. I've never seen so many zeros in my account," he exclaimed while picking up Izuku and spinning him around before stopping and asking him, "Do you know what this means?" "No more money trouble," Izuku answers. "No." "Well, yes, but that is not the only thing. We could use this money to start our research facility. And if we offer these to the other hospitals in the other provinces in Japan, we could make more." Egon told him. "I'm glad to hear that because I've been doing a little cyber searching and found this," Izuku said to him while bringing up a new page on the computer and showing a nearly run-down research facility. "It's pretty beat up and needs a lot of rework. But I'm pretty sure that would be cheaper than trying to build or even buy one already made. We might need to budget slightly, but it's more than doable. Also, I found a good construction company to help with the first bit. Uraraka Construction Company," Izuku explained with a nervous smile, unsure of how he would react. "You have been a busy little worker bee." Egon praised him while rubbing his head. "Of course, then comes the expenses of trying to get new equipment, paying for bills, and employees. We need to find a more sustainable way to make money, at least until we can get our feet off the ground," he told Izuku. "Oh, I have a few ideas for that," Izuku excitedly proclaimed. Egon smiled at this before his face turned into one of foresight and asked, "By the way, kid, have you told your parents about what you've been doing? I can't believe I haven't thought to ask this before, but from an outside perspective, you spend so much time with me does seem strange, to put it lightly." Izuku's expression shifted, and he admitted while avoiding eye contact, "No, I haven't told my mom." Egon shucked air between his teeth and told him, "That's bad. And now that you mention it, there is a strange rumor going around about me. Saying that I'm going on dates with older rich guys," Izuku admitted while putting a thoughtful expression on his face. "You? I don't even like to date people my age, forget somebody younger." Egon shivered with disgust, saying, "We need to fix that." "Yeah," Izuku admitted, already feeling the weight of responsibility hit him. How in the world would he be able to explain all of this to his mother easily? How would she react, or would she even accept it? Only time and the meet-up date could tell. Ch5, permission. Izuku sat at his dinner table, silent in his thoughts as his mother made them a hot meal. He played with his fingers, lost in his thoughts and emotions about what he should do. It has been decided that they should confront their problem head-on. But saying it on paper was far more accessible than putting it into practice. The plan was to ease her into what's been happening before getting into the heavier stuff. This is where he was now, waiting for an opportunity or instead just to work up the nerve to say it. He sighed and decided now would be the best time, especially since Egon would be here soon. "So, Mom." Izuku starts as his mother just hums in reply. He gulps and finally admits, "You know how I've been telling you that I'm doing after-school activities, which is why I'm always coming home so late." Another him, and he takes a breath before relenting, "Well, I was lying. I figured," she said back. Izuku's eyes shot wide open as he stared at her. His mouth gaped in shock, and he blabbered, "Wait, you knew?" She giggles and tells him, looking over her shoulder with a smile, "I'm your mother, sweetie. You can't hide anything from me. So what have you been up to?" "Well, it has to do with the friend who I told you would be coming over today," Izuku told her while looking at the third plate setup. Before he could continue, there was a knock at the door, and Izuku told her, "That must be him." Inko turned off the stove and slipped off her oven mitts as she followed her son to the front door. Izuku unlocked and opened it while introducing, "Mom, I'd like you to meet Dash." Before he could finish, Egon stumbled through the doorway, clearly leaning on the door in the best business suit he owned. A thick stack of papers was in his hands, and he tried to stay on his feet and prevented himself from letting the osiers go everywhere. Once he fixed himself, he adjusted his glasses, looked at the short, puggy woman, and stammered out in a half-exhausted mess, "Hello, Mrs. Izuku, I'm Processor No wait. I mean, I'm Professor Izuku, and you're Mrs. Egon No. I mean, hello, Mrs. Green Midoriya. I meant to say Midoriya." While Inko was more than confused and a bit on edge, Egon started to rifle through his papers and told her, "Hold on. I have it here somewhere." He then pulled out a sheet of paper and read quickly, "Hello, how are you? That's great to hear. I'm Professor." But before he could continue on his half-pronounced gargle, all the papers he was holding slipped from his hand, and they flew all over the front entry. Egon panicked so hard that his glasses fell off, and he exclaimed, "Shoot. Not again. I had this all set up for maximum success." He then started to look through all the papers rapidly and pulled up some quickly while reading them off: potassium, zinc, hydrogen, nitrogen, sugar, oxygen. He paused after saying that. Looking up from the paper with tears in his eyes, he said, "That was the chemical compound for chocolate milk." "Professor Egon," Izuku draws out as the professor scrambles. "Izuku, sweetie, what is going on, and who is this mess of a man? I'm honestly a bit freaked out," Inko asked while getting closer to her son in defense. "Professor, I told you not to overthink this," Izuku scolded the man. With tears streaming down his face, he blubbered out, "I tried. But I couldn't help it. How are we going to explain this to my mom if you can't act normal in a non-business or professional manner?" Izuku half yelled at him. "I have no social skills," he yelled in self-shame and pity. "Izuku." Inko spoke once more, feeling freaked out. Seeing no way out of it now, he bit the bullet and admitted, "Mom, this is the real reason I've been out of the house so often. Izuku, Inko gasped while grabbing her son's face and telling him on the verge of tears, if you needed money, you should have just asked. Don't do something like this. Izuku was initially confused but quickly realized what she was implying and exclaimed, what? No, 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 Mom, it's not like that. Finally foregoing his papers, Egon stood up and defended himself, saying, I know I didn't give you the best first impression, but believe me, I have no intentions of that nature. Then what have a 30-year-old man and my son been doing all alone for several weeks, she assumes back while putting herself in front of her son. He's been working with me. Egon told her quickly without explanation. Who? Inko choked back, confused once more. Izuku knew this was his chance. He had to use his ace in the hole. If he didn't, his mom would go for the phone, and everything the two of them had been building would be destroyed. So he took a deep breath and readied himself. Mom. I don't want to be a hero anymore. He said out of the blue. What? Inko asked, stupefied by the proclamation. She turned to her son and held his hand. She asked him, Izuku, baby, what happened? You wanted to be a hero for as long as you could walk and talk. Why would you suddenly change that? I gave up on that dream a long time ago. It's not worth it anymore, Izuku admitted while looking away. Izuku, Inko said in a slight, shaky tone. Mrs. Midoriya, Egon butted in as respectfully as he could with a few papers in his hands. Several weeks ago, I found these papers from one of your son's analysis notebooks. I was floored by the amount of details and information on each page. Finding things that others wouldn't. His intelligence and observation skills are unmatched. So, I tracked him down and asked him to help me with a project I was working on when he was in a slump. And thanks to him, in the last few weeks, he's made huge discoveries and some money to boot, he explained with ever-growing excitement while handing the torn note pages. Then a key word hit her mind in the mists of all her confusion and emotions, and she said, baffled, money. Around $50 million, Egon casually told her. Dropping the papers and holding the wall, she exclaimed, 50 million. Egon nods his head excitedly and tells her, yes. And it is all thanks to your son. Your son is a true genius, like none I've seen before. He has a gift that so many neglect or fail to gain. Your son is amazing. He then started to get on his knees and told her while bowing and half yelling, so I ask you, no, I beg you. Please allow your son to continue working with me. He could change the world. Inko remained silent for a long while, allowing everything to sink in before turning to her son and asking, Izuku, is this really what you want? He nods and tells her with full sincerity, it is. I don't think I've been so sure in a long time. She sighed, held her son, and relented, then I guess I'll have no choice but to support you. Oh, thank you, Thank you, Egon practically yelled from the floor. But you know my son is still in school, Inko asks as he brings up his head. We've taken care of that, Egon tells her. He doesn't have the right certifications, Inko argues back. He can work on his degree while working with me. I know of some websites that allow you to get a legal degree, Egon assures her. He's about to start high school, she continued. I never really made it through high school myself, he admits. Inko thinks it over, then barters, I want him home at a more reasonable time. Trust me, I've been trying that myself, Egon rolls his eyes while glaring at Izuku, who looks away. I want you to pay him, Inko tells him. Egon nods to this and tells her, I was already planning on that. Once things got up and running and he had his degree, I was going to make him vice president. My son. A vice president, Inko gasps while holding her chest. Her lips then began to quiver, and before either of the two men could act, Inko started to shed tears like a faucet. Taken aback by this reaction, Egon jumped up and stepped back a bit. Hey, are you okay? He asked her. Mom, please stop crying, Izuku begs her as he starts to cry the same way she does, making Egon think this will be a long dinner, which it was. Ch6, sufficient funds. Izuku and Egon sat at his kitchen table with the room constructed into a mock meeting room. A large whiteboard was hanging on the wall, with Egon at the front and Izuku sitting on one of the 4 chairs around the dinner table. Egon, with a pointer stick in hand and many colored dry erase markers in hand, points to the board with a crudely drawn American dollar. "Well, Izuku, we have a problem," he told him while pointing at the drawing. "Money?" he questioned while looking at the drawing. Egon nods affirmatively and erases it while drawing more crude pictures and explaining, "As you well know, we are nearly out of the 50 million earned from the hospitals. Between buying, fixing, and expanding our new laboratory, plus the costs of our machinery, we're at almost nothing. We still have more expensive things to buy and do, more high-tech equipment and items used for experimentation, the monthly bill to run it, taxes, and employees." Izuku thought momentarily and then offered, "We could go to the other provinces in Japan and sell some of the splinters to those hospitals." Egon thinks on this, draws a pic of a splinter and a chart, then says, "That would pay for most, if not all, of what we need right now. But it's not sustainable in the long run. And trust me, it'll go fast," he told him while making the chart grow and then plummet before sighing in exasperation and complaining, "Sometimes I wish Japan wasn't so small. We have to think up a way to make a large and consistent cash flow without direct funding from the government." Izuku nods thoughtfully and says, "The last thing we need is for them to get their hands on what we have." Egon nods back and states, "I agree. The less, the better. Until we are more assured in our funds, what ideas do you have or what discoveries have you made?" Izuku takes out his notebook and flips through it, telling him, "Do you remember how one of the splinters absorbed BLD and reproduced it?" Egon sighed, knowing where this was going, and waved him off, saying, "If we sell BLD splinters of every type to every hospital, we'll be right back where we are." "Not that," Izuku exclaimed firmly, making Egon jump from the suddenness. Izuku sat back down, calming himself and saying, "I mean, do you know of that one person who's been making rounds in the medical world, the one with the unique BLD quirk?" Egon raises an eyebrow, thinks, and then realizes what he means. Then answered an explanation, "The man with a BLD quirk that instantly changes to any BLD type it comes in contact with, even rare ones. The BLD can even replace diseased or cancer-ridden cells. The BLD that's more packed with cells per square millimeter than any high-altitude animal on the planet. I know about him." Izuku exclaims, "If we could get a sample and put it in a crystal, we could sell it off in individual BLD packs along with every other BLD type." Egon smiled at seeing the kid's far-thinking and smiled sadly before informing him, "Normally, I'd agree with you, however, there's just one glaring problem. Getting that BLD is nearly impossible. He's constantly hounded by every hospital just for even a syringe full of his BLD. People pay him oodles of money just to get some of it. We'd have to pay him a good chunk of our 50 million just to get a small sample. And because of all the money he's gotten, he has become an absolute self-entitled douchebag. I mean, samples of his BLD on the black market go for hundreds of thousands. Sometimes even millions. I don't think we have to worry about that," Izuku tells him while reaching into his coat and pulling out a vial filled with red liquid. "Is that?" Egon asks as he approaches and takes the vial. After looking it over, he says, ruffling his hair, "Shut up." "But wait, how did you dash?" "I had to get my hands dirty and face," Izuku told him, looking away and rubbing a black and blue spot on his cheek. Egon's eyes widened at this, and he looked over at Izuku, seeing the many injuries that he covered up with clothes or makeup. He asks in a terrified voice, "Izuku, what did you do?" You know how he's prejudiced, Izuku tells him. "I'm aware. He's one of those quirkiest BSTRDS. Seriously, what did you do?" Egon asked in a concerned and fast tone. "I accidentally bumped into him after he got kicked out of a bar. I tried to sweet-talk him, but he wouldn't have it." Izuku began to explain. Egon bit his fists and said, "I don't like where this is going." Then I told him I was quirkless, and he started to beat me, the teen finished off while looking away. "What?" Egon shouted in shock. But I defended myself. And in doing so, I got a sample. He tried to reassure the man while holding the vial like it was gold. It took hours to get rid of all the alcohol inside. But it's a pure strain, he said excitedly. Egon grabbed his shoulder and asked him in worry, Izuku, why did you do that? He could have killed you. I was prepared. We needed the money, Izuku argued back. Egon rapidly shook his head and told him, that's no excuse to put yourself in danger purposefully. There were other ways we could get money without you getting hurt. Izuku looked down, realizing his mistake as Egon leaned against the board and said in a trembling voice, if your mother finds out she's not just gonna have a cow with me, but a whole dang elephant. After he gets done venting about this, he sighs and holds Izuku in a hug. He asks, just promise me you won't take any risks like that again. You're far too young to be acting like this. I promise. Izuku hugs him back. Egon pulls away and says to him, good. This will help us reduce many of our costs, but we need more. We can only sell these at maybe a couple hundred a pack. Then, of course, that super helium we've managed to make with one of the gas splinters. I have one other idea that I have sort of put into practice, Izuku admitted as Egon walked away to think. What else have you been doing behind my back? Egon said jokingly. Izuku pouted, arguing, I haven't been doing anything behind your back. You're just never there to watch me. Egon sighed and told him, well, I am the one who's in charge of ensuring we don't go into the red. We'll discuss this later, but tell me what you've done for now. You know how the crystal radiates a kind of radioactive energy, Izuku asks him as he nods in return. Well, I decided to see what would happen if something was exposed to it for a long period of time. Oh God, I don't like where this is going, Egon says under his breath. Iu waved his hands and tells him, no, it's okay, I promise. I just used a pigeon for an experiment. Egon blinks and states seriously, Izuku, the last thing I need around here is some giant laser-shooting murder bird. Do you see one? He sassed back. Egon looked around, sat in a chair, and said, okay. Well, I'm not sure what happened entirely. Whether it evolved, devolved, or even genetically morphed, Izuku ranted off. Getting concerned, Egon asked him, Izuku, can you please just get to the point? You're starting to freak me out. Izuku then went to another room, came out with something behind his back, and brought it out while admitting, I made this. Placed on the table was a creature that was a bird, about the size of a turkey, but not one. Egon blinked, adjusting his glasses, he leaned in. After making sure he wasn't just seeing things, he sat back, not taking his eyes off the bird, and stated, okay, first off, that's the least bad thing I could have expected. Second, is that what I think it is? He exclaimed while pointing at the bird, spooking it and making it run. Before it could Juno off the table, Egon grabbed the bird and examined it all around, saying, I mean, it makes some sense. Dodo birds and pigeons are biological cousins, and the dodo is large and flightless. Also, how did you hide this from me? You don't use the space you have properly, Izuku told him with a shrug. Egon opened his mouth to argue but stopped and admitted, fair. So what's your plan with essentially recreating an extinct species? Izuku then went into the microwave and pulled out a meat dish while offering, taste this. Egon shrugs and pops a piece of the meat in his mouth. After chewing it a bit, he swallows and observes, a tad gamey, but it's pretty good. He then makes the connection and asks, wait, is this dashi? Izuku nods, and the cigs turn in the man's head. Once he realizes this, he guesses aloud, you plan to capitalize on the invasive and wild pigeons in the city, turn them into dodo, and sell the meat for a profit. Izuku nodded and assured him, and don't worry. I tested the meat in excruciating detail. It's completely safe for consumption. It's pretty much no different from FDA-certified poultry meat. And I got a butcher on our side with a little bit of incentive. He said this while making a money sign with his hand. I was wondering why there was a large deposit to a butcher shop, Egon said to himself before suspiciously asking, anything else? I was hoping to test the crystal's radioactive effects on different plants to see if we could potentially make a superfood, Izuku tells him pleadingly. Egon squeezes air through his teeth and tells him, let's put a pin on that. We don't need to be doing a recreation of Little Shop of Horrors. Izuku looks disappointed by this, so Egon comes up with an alternative and asserts, but you can do one plant at a time, and nothing else. Just make sure they're either small flowers or vegetables. Izuku nods and blabbers aloud, if only we could use one of the splinters to make gold. Then, a thought strikes him, and he asks Egon, wait. Can't gold be made into a liquid? And my crystals are heat-resistant to a few thousand degrees, Egon tells him as the wheels also start to turn. Then the two of them look directly at each other, and Egon states seriously, I'll get some gold and smelt it. You run some tests. We take this to our graves. Izuku nods and runs off to his office space as Egon does. Ch7, celebration. After another long and boring day at school, Izuku finally made it to his front door. He didn't go to Egon's house today because he told him he couldn't come for some reason. So he went straight home, and now he was at the door. After unblocking and walking in, he called out, Mom. I'm home. Just then, at that moment, the dark house exploded into light, and the sound of popping hit his ears, followed by confetti and streamers falling on his face and head. Two voices cheered, Congratulations. What who? Mom, Professor. What's going on? Izuku asked dumbfounded. It's a party, Inko explained. For you, Egon follows up. Me. What for? Izuku asks back, still unsure of what they meant. You seriously don't know? Inko asks as he shakes his head. She giggles and tells him, Izuku, you passed. Egon saw that Izuku didn't understand, so he jumped in and exclaimed, you passed your last test and aced it. You officially have your 4th degree. You have a doctoral degree. You can officially, and most importantly, legally work for me. I thought I was still at, Izuku stated, still a bit confused and overwhelmed. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if you didn't try to shoot straight for an honorary degree, Egon praised him. Inko told him, it's also the day that your research facility has finally completed construction. This finally snapped Izuku out of his funk, and he exclaimed excitedly, wait. For real? That's awesome. It's also your graduation day, Egon added in. But I thought that wasn't for another 2 weeks, Izuku asked back, feeling confused and concerned if he had lost track of time, which he had done a lot recently. Inko nods and tells him, it is, but since you'll be so busy very soon, we thought it would be best to have the party now. She then hugs her son and tells him, Izuku, I'm sorry. Taken aback by this, Izuku pulls back. Holding his mom's arms, he questions her, what dash? Mom, why are you sorry? Because I feel partly to blame for your previous situation, she admitted while looking away. When I came to terms with the fact that you wanted to be a hero, even without a quirk, I was beside myself with worry. As your mother, I tried my best to support you, but in the back of my mind, I prayed you'd give up. I'm sorry, she told him with tears in her eyes, looking away in shame. She wipes her face and then tells him with a more upbeat attitude, but seeing you here and now. Accomplishing more than I could ever expect and more than anyone else in the world, especially myself, and at your age, I can't help but feel proud of you. So very, very proud of you, she told him all teary-eyed again. Mom, Izuku said, on the verge of tears, before wrapping her in a hug and telling her, thank you for always supporting and believing in me. Izuku, Egon lightly interjected at the moment. When they pull away, the man wraps his arm over his shoulder and tells him, this time is all about you. If not for you, none of this would have happened. You and you alone made all of this happen. You should feel proud of yourself for all you've managed to achieve. As far as I'm concerned, you're my hero, Izuku. Izuku's dam finally breaks, and he plunges his face into his chest while sobbing, thank you, Professor. For giving me a chance when no one else would. Egon pets and rubs his back for a bit but soon pulls him off while drying his face and proclaiming, okay. Enough of the waterworks. Let's eat and be merry. It indeed was a great party. Ch8 A last confrontation. Izuku sat up from his desk and rolled his shoulders after sitting hunched over his desk. It has been another normal, quiet, and tedious day at school. Actually, it's been nothing but boring since Egon gave him all the coursework to copy directly from and get a passing grade. Surprisingly, no one, not even Bakugo, had bothered him once in the past months. It was kind of nice to be ignored by everyone and not have to deal with them. And he wouldn't have to any longer since this was the last day of school. Their teacher left early, allowing them to do whatever they wanted until the bell rang. And boy, was Izuku glad that it did, because he could swear he could feel Bakugo trying to burn holes into his head as he sat behind him. So, after stretching and waiting for just about everyone else to leave, he muttered under his breath, "Thank goodness it's over." "Oi Deku," the loud voice of Bakugo yelled at him. "Oh no," he mumbled with a sigh. He turned around in time to see the seemingly ever-furious Bakugo trudge toward him with his 2 tag-alongs. "Don't you ignore me, nerd," he demanded. "Yes, Kaken," Izuku asked back in a neutral tone. Seeing him not reacting like a scared dog made Bakugo make an expression crossed between irritation and confusion as he asked while poking his chest, "What's up with you, huh? You've been acting weirder than normal. Quieter, more reserved, you're practically not here. I've forgotten you were still here for a few weeks." "So," Izuku shrugged in reply. "So," Bakugo exclaimed. "So what? I'm not bothering or looking down on you like you hate so much. What's the problem?" "I thought you'd like that," Izuku told him without emotion in his voice or expression on his body. Bakugo growled and exclaimed, "It sizz me off. It's like you're planning something or doing something behind my back." Izuku sighs, exhausted, and asks back, "Will nothing I do satisfy you? You never seem happy about the result, whether I'm in your face or as far away as possible." "What did you say?" Bakugo yelled into his face. Izuku finches at him, getting into his face, but he calms himself and turns away, saying, "Goodbye, Kaken." "Hold it," he yelled while grabbing his collar and holding him up to his face. "I'm not done with you, nerd. You're still acting weird, and I want to know why." Izuku said and did nothing as Bakugo held him up, making the teen growl and yell, "You'd better not still be trying to be a hero." In the past, Izuku would have been like his usual self, squeaking and cowering in fear, protecting his face from any attack. But ever since the day Bakugo told him to, he's become entirely numb to anything he could do or say. It did not affect him anymore, the fear he had no longer controlled him. And Bakugo couldn't use it to control him either. "I'm not," he said in a cold, calm voice. "Well, you'd better, wait, what?" Bakugo suddenly repressed his anger and went straight in, flabbergasted. Izuku sighs again, pulls off his hand, and yells at him, "I'm not Kaken. I give up. You were right, and I was wrong. You win. Are you happy now?" "I what?" "Why?" Bakugo blabbered out while taking a step back. This time, it was Izuku's turn to demand back, "Why? Why do you care? You've never cared before, so why start now?" Bakugo took another step backward, completely confused as to what was happening as Izuku continued, "I've stopped trying to be a hero, okay? You'll never see me again. You won't have to deal with me again. Isn't that what you've wanted?" Bakugo said nothing in return, he just stared at him with his mouth open in shock. Izuku dropped his arms and told him, "And you know what? For whatever it's worth, I'm glad I won't be seeing you again." Izuku grabbed his bag and, just before walking past him, said, "See you never, Kaken." After leaving the school, Izuku made a beeline straight for the newly constructed research facility. It took him about 30 minutes on foot, but only because he thought so much about what had just happened and how it would affect things from here. But before he could get any more lost in his mind, he arrived at the front of the facility, where Egon had called out to him. "Ah. Izuku. There you are. I and your mother were getting worried," Egon exclaimed as he waved over the boy, his mother standing beside him. Izuku turned his head after trotting over to them and said apologetically, sorry. I was kind of dragging my feet. Did you have a good last day? I'm sorry I wasn't able to come to get you. Inko also apologizes to him. It's okay, Mom. We're here now, Izuku assures her while changing the subject. Then, a sharp ahem grabbed both of their attention, and they both looked over to Egon, who had a large set of scissors while standing in front of a large sheet of paper covering everything in front and 8 feet up. Well then, without further ado. Lady and gentlemen, might I present our brand new research facility to you, Egon cried out while cutting the banner and exposing the new building for the two Midoriyas to gawk at. The building is what you would expect to see out of a research facility. It is a huge building with squared off everything, made of white stone from the outside, with huge glass windows and more offshoot buildings with almost no distinguished marks, nearly uniform to everything else. All except the front, which was the most creatively designed part, which had stone stairs leading up to it as it stood on a raised surface. As they stood in awe of the building, Egon approached Izuku's side and placed a hand around his shoulder. While motioning to it, he said, "Look at it, Izuku. This is the culmination of all of our hard work. Together, we will make some big discoveries and even bigger changes. I hope to see it through as long as I can," Izuku told him with a smile. So do I. So do I, Egon agreed while looking up and seeing a long-time part of his dream come true, wiping a tear from his eyes. A thought crossed his mind, and he asked, "Say, what do you want to start on first?" Izuku thought momentarily, looking like he didn't want to tell, but finally opened up and said, "Well, for starters, I'd like to do more experiments with the singularity soul's radiation on plants and animals." And Egon questions him after hearing the boy fall off. Izuku shook his head and waved it off while saying, "Never mind. Forget it. What about you, Professor?" Egon placed a finger on his chin and answered, "Truthfully, I'd like to figure out a name for this place. Do you have anything?" Izuku thought about this briefly before finally offering, "How about CH9, experimentation log, subject the plants." This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting from the Tensora Research Lab, where we are performing and recording our first experimentation on the singularity soul and the effects of its radiation. I will be using different kinds of plant life as the first subjects for this experiment. My previous attempts at this experiment back in Professor Egon Cristallo's home were less than ideal. Allow me to explain. Since we needed the proper technology or facilities that could amicably be used in case of some sort of emergency in which a plant becomes too dangerous, the professor strictly forbade me from doing multiple experiments on those of much larger plants. Instead, have me do it on smaller things such as flowers. Unfortunately, after a time of being subjected to the singularity soul's radiation signature for long PRDS, even in the most compatible conditions, they would all die within days to hours. My longest living specimen was a bonsai tree that only lived for about 1 week after prolonged exposure. Hopefully, in the future, I will be able to adjust the radiation from the crystal so smaller plants may be able to survive and show some sign of change. In saying that, we now have far more resources and the facilities needed to combat any sort of unforeseen hiccups. Anyway, the first batch of plants I've used are as follows: 1 American cherry tree sapling, 1 crawling ivy sprout, 1 pumpkin seedling, and 1 adult American pitcher plant. Note: Professor Egon told me not to use a Venus flytrap since it might, in his words, make an Audrey. After planting all the plants in the facility's newly constructed greenhouse, I planted 1 empty soul splinter into the soil to absorb the energy in both roots and air. In addition, I have the plants on an automatic water and light timer for maximum production and consistent readings for all plants in the controlled environment. I will report back when any changes are made. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting to say that it didn't take long at all. I've only been gone about 3 days, and massive results have already been made. All the plants I've used in the experiment have grown to their adult size, which explains why all the flowers I used died so quickly. The energy in the crystal didn't kill it, it aged it to the point where it died of old age. I must note this down for future use. Anyhow, as I expected, not only had the plants grown in size, but changed on a biological level. First is the American cherry tree. in addition to growing to the size of an adult tree of its genus, it also changed color. Its leaves turned blue, its flowers a bright red, and its fruit a bright white. After some testing, I found that the cherry fruits would explode like firecrackers upon being broken. However, if frozen for 20 minutes, the fruit turns a cool pink and becomes edible for human consumption. Note, they have a tart taste to them. Next is the crawling ivy. It grew so massive and quickly that it reached out of its pot and up towards the glass roof. When I attempted to cut them back, several vines wrapped around me and began to tickle me relentlessly. After freeing myself, I took a leaf sample and saw that it was covered in a toxin response to the tickle reaction in our skin, which was used as a defense mechanism. Note, use fire at a distance. Then we have the pumpkin. Unlike regular ones, which simply grow a few pumpkins on one vine, this one grew several dozen tiny ones on a single vine and from a single flower. After some analysis, I found that the new mini pumpkins were the size of cherry tomatoes and tasted very sweet. In addition, when touched, they emit a faint purple light. After a round of different tests, I discovered that when they are broken off from the vine and blown into the stem, the pumpkin will begin to inflate like a balloon. And contrary to what I thought before, no matter if the good is broken, bruised, or cut, it will not deflate. It will keep its size and continue to swell up with more air pressure so long as its stem is intact. I even put it through a high-powered air press pump, making it swell up to 14 inches in diameter. I would have let it go longer, but it may not have a size limit. Note, this could help the worldwide hunger crisis. And finally, the American pitcher plant. Boy, this one changed. Not only did it asexually reproduce, but it grew far bigger than any currently known pitcher plant species. In addition, it gained several larger back leaves and a new set of vibrant colors on said leaves and its body. Its innards make a very sweet and insisting aromatic that even I was drawn to. When I got within 30 feet of the plants, they began to rustle and bristle their leaves. As they did so, the waving and vibrating colors began to induce a hypnotic effect, and with the sweet smell dampening my senses, I walked toward it. Luckily, I managed to break out quickly. Though even if I had gotten too close to the plants, they were still far too small for me to fit in. And couldn't move any other part. Note, I'm really glad I listened to the professor's no Venus flytrap rule. From this data alone, I now have several working theories on what may have happened. I will attempt one more mass test and see what happens from there. I will update again when I have started the process. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting again on the next round of experiments. So, a day has passed, and I've set up the next round of experiments. This time, I used a corn seed, a potato sprout, a garlic clove, a carrot seed, and 2 different types of cactus trimmings, more specifically, a golden barrel and saguaro. I will report back when the results have been made. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting once more to update you on the new rounds of plants and their effects under the singularity soul's radiation. Like last time, it came quickly. I'll start in the order I listed in my previous report. First, the corn, like all the others, it grew to full maturity in just a few days and surprisingly sprouted the same number of ears as it usually does. However, when I opened one of them up, the corn kernels were colored and reflective like glass. When brought up to sunlight, they reflected it very similarly to a magnifying glass, and I had to quickly cover it up before it shot rays of deadly sunlight at me. In addition, I found that when dropped, whether in or out of the leaves, the corn kernels would explode and scatter like a hand-thrown grenade. Note: attempts to make popcorn are now prohibited. Then, the potato, I was surprised to see it was one of the few that didn't change externally. I had wondered what it could do until I placed my phone next to it, and it began to charge from the wireless function. After a bit of testing, I found out that its natural electrical charge had been amped up tenfold, and now it was like an industrial battery, no matter its size. Note: food made with it has an electric taste to it. Next, the garlic. I almost thought it wasn't ripe when I pulled it out because it was green. Then I found out it was when I accidentally ripped off the stem, and it quickly changed from green to yellow, then orange, and finally red. I figured out what was going on after yellow and threw it. After it hit red, it exploded into a gas compound that irritates the throat when inhaled and smells terrible. Luckily, I was close to the airflow controls before it hit me. Note: onions would be the same, but with tear gas instead. Now, the carrot, it's gold, solid gold. But it's edible and can be eaten raw. Surprisingly, it acts like a revitalizer in a video game. I was at my 5th cup of coffee when I ate one and felt all my exhaustion disappear. Note: don't try to trade it in for money. And finally, we have the 2 cacti. The golden barrel has turned black with pink flowers, and the saguaro now has skin that seems to be some sort of natural metal. The golden barrel can shoot its spines when disturbed, and then it turns golden and regrows all its spines before turning back again. If it's disturbed while trying to regrow its missing spines, it'll spray a nasal irritant from any flowers it has that causes uncontrollable sneezing fits. As for the saguaro, it has grown twice the size of its normal kind and even wider. It has lost all its spines and now turned a metallic gray. It's made of metal. It showed the same strength as military and construction-grade metal when tested. In addition, when a piece of the cactus was removed, it would quickly regenerate the missing pieces. However, removing a piece was the hard part, as I had to cut it off with a cutting torch. Note: don't drink the water inside. Upon careful study of what I've seen and made, one of my theories happens to be correct. The radiation of the singularity soul caused these plants to develop quirks. It's rare in animals, but it's unheard of in plants. Anyhow, this is unheard of and massive, and it could change everything we know about the world and science in general. So does that mean our evolution and the emergence of quirk was all thanks to radiation? If so, it couldn't have been from this single specimen. There must be more. A huge vein somewhere. We'll have to figure that out at a later date. When I gave my findings to Egon, I expected him to be excited and not go into cardiac arrest from shock. It was a fun day with the paramedics. I will take a break from the plant-based tests and move on to animal tests to see what the radiation can accomplish. If it can cause evolution or quirks, I must find out how. I will find out how. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya signing off for now. CH10, Experimentation Log, Subject Vanimals. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting on the newest Singularity Soul experiment. To recap my last round of tests, I subjected several different plants in the same controlled environment to the radiation given off by the crystal through an empty splinter. In short, I found that the radiation causes rapid aging and the appearance of quirks, which is a world-shattering piece of news on its own. Anyhow, my next target is to see whether the same thing happens to animals. The reason I test this and not just conclude it, despite the existence of several animals with quirks, is the fact of what happened the first time I tried it. In short, I used an empty splinter, a different one, on a pigeon and turned it into a dodo. Was that the quirk, or did evolution take hold? That's why I'm testing it. On a side note, the one dodo that I showed Professor Egon has been adopted by us and made the honorary facility mascot and pet. We call him Pete. Continuing with my experiments, I have since marked off a few testing rooms and chambers in the animal testing to accomplish this. Now, I know what you're thinking, but don't worry, we will ensure that all the creatures used are not tortured. They live no different lives than house pets. Having said that, I decided to start small and use an order mail and farm. After some words with Professor Egon, he convinced me to do it behind a sealed chamber door lined with thick metal. On the chance, they turn into giant monster ants. With that, I set a splinter beside them and waited. Luckily, I didn't have to wait long since they all died a few hours later. I can only guess that, like the flowers and their ages, they were unable to withstand the radiation and overaged to death. I'll have to use something a bit bigger. For the next experiment, I decided to use 2 subjects, an ordinary pet store goldfish and a koi fish. Both subjects were placed in the same divided aquarium with the splinter in their vicinity. I will report once any changes have been made. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting again. After just 3 days, the results were finally obtained with the 2 fish. In short, the pet store goldfish is dead, and the koi fish now shimmers when exposed to direct sunlight. Note, these could make for good decorations at the research facility's entryway. From this, the effects of the radiation are entirely dependent on the size of the creature and not what kind of creature it is. The next round of experiments will be subjected to amphibians and birds. I will report back as soon as I have everything set up. Okay, I finally got my hands on all the animals needed for this next test. This time, I am using two vastly different kinds of animals of varying sizes, amphibians and birds. I am using an axolotl, a giant salamander, and a newt for the amphibians. As for the birds, I am once again using wild pigeons around Japan, such as chickens, budgies, and peacocks. In addition, I will also be testing an octopus that was accidentally sent alongside the three amphibians. Once again, I put all the animals in different testing chambers in the same controlled environments. The amphibians were allowed in the same tank but divided. I'll accept the octopus, which was put in a completely separate tank. I have placed an empty splinter within their vicinity. The birds were all placed in different enclosures in the same testing chamber, divided off for their safety. An empty splinter was placed within their vicinity. I'll report back once any signs of change are seen. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting some fantastic news about the most recent experiments. I need to figure out where to start or how to make this reporting coherent. But first, I'll just start with how most of the experiments went before I get onto the amazing discovery. I periodically checked on all the creatures once every day. No signs had been made until about the second and fourth day, respectively. First, I will be starting with the amphibians and the octopus. The axolotl has gained the ability to control water and can move freely from its tank. It's a good thing I checked in on it periodically because the radiation was starting to get to it, and it was using its newfound quirk to move away from the splinter. Note, make a covered and watertight tank. Then there is the giant salamander, which surprisingly has shown no signs of a quirk. It's still being determined whether it's simply immune to the effects of the radiation, if some creatures like humans cannot develop quirks, or if it is merely evolutionarily perfect. Either way, it remains the same no matter how much time has passed. Note, it's sort of nice to know that some creatures can be quirkless. Next, the newt, it's dead. Surprisingly, however, this isn't due to the radiation from the splinter. It was actually due to its own developed quirk. I'm not sure what it was, but it just exploded. Note, study the remains to see what happened. Last of all was the octopus. It showed no physical changes except for its brain. The radiation has caused its brain, which normally wraps around its esophagus, to disconnect and become separate in the body, allowing it to swell up to 3 times its normal capacity. This also includes many more wrinkles in the brain. In short, it got smarter, a lot smarter. So smart that it now has a minor form of sentience and sapience. The way I found this out was when it asked me, in Morse code, to give back the crystal, so it could continue to grow. I was both highly intrigued and extremely scared of what that could mean. For now, I have denied its request and placed it in a new aquarium to be studied. Note, learn Morse code. After this are the birds. The first one is the peacock. Somehow, the hole it hypnotizes with its tail fossard came true. Raising and shaking its tail feathers induces a hypnotic effect so long as eye contact is constantly made. I was fortunate enough that it dropped its tail and ran as I approached. Note, make hypnotic-proof goggles. Then the budgie, it didn't change externally like the peacock, but instead, its vocals did. The bird can now mimic any sound it hears ideally, and at the decibels it sounds at, apart from speech. I've tested gunshots, car keys, bells, a dog's bark, Pete's grunts, the flicking of a light SWCH, the buzz of electricity, and the honk of a tuba. I even gave it a rendition of one of Mozart's symphonies, and it copied it perfectly with all the instruments present. My one mistake was allowing it to hear my ringtone, and now it pranks me by making the same noise. I've discovered that its intelligence has grown to that of an American grey parrot. Note, change ringtones. Next is the chicken. It's by far the strangest one yet. Its brain has quadrupled in size. It's so large that it stretches the skin on its head to the point it's nearly translucent. I wonder how it can still stand and walk, let alone still be alive. I'm still wondering what happened to its skull if it still has it. As I'm sure you can guess, besides having one of the largest brain-to-body sizes in the history of his species and every animal on Earth, it has numerous wrinkles in its brain. This is as smart, if not smarter, than most people. Note, she has been able to speak with me through a text-to-speech generator and has formally asked for a job. Last of all is the pigeon. I was most surprised by this since it didn't change into a dodo as I expected. It only gains a quirk similar to that of the hero hawks. It can shoot, control, and reattach its feathers, in addition to giving off a faint white glow. This baffled me, so I'll experiment and see what happens from there. This is Dr. Izuku. Oh, forget it. This is too important for formalities. I've made a breakthrough since my last report. I truly underestimated the power of the singularity soul. It's more powerful than I could have imagined. I should stop gushing and get to the point. Finding that a pigeon was given a quirk instead of being turned into a pigeon made me wonder about something. What did I do differently that caused it to change so drastically? After a bit, I figured it out and decided to run the same pigeon test, this time with 2 different empty splinters. The first one was the splinter, which I used to test the plants and animals, and the second was the one I originally used to turn the pigeons into dodos for money. I placed both in the vicinity of 2 pigeons in different testing chambers, and after a few days, the same thing happened. One changed into a dodo, and the other gained the same quirk as the first test subject. This led me to 2 different discoveries. The first is that any creature or plant of the same type, except for humans, will always have the same quirk. The second is that the energy fluctuations in the splinters cause different effects. I found this out by taking the splinters and running them under an energy wavelength reader. I discovered that the quirk splinter was positively charged while the evolution splinter was negatively charged. So, it depends on what frequency it's at and how much was put into each splinter. A fact I found out later is that it depends on what effect it gives off. Does that also translate to whatever the splinter absorbs? I can even control the frequency of the energy to see what other effects they have, different experiments for different days. So, I tested this once more using 2 female sheep. I kept them in separate testing chambers with the same controlled environment, with both splinters in each room. I'll report back on my findings. Okay, the tests were a complete success and have revealed another important piece of information on the radiation effect. These are my full findings on each subject. The sheep that had the quirk splinter did develop a quirk, some form of electrokinesis. It can generate electricity through its wool to do several things. It can release the pent-up energy at will, use it to increase its speed, create a force field, and charge ions of electricity in the air, allowing it to float and air walk. It's also gained a taste for sugar and tobacco. I'm still trying to figure out why. When sheared and proceeded into clothes, it had a very tingly feeling to it. When its meat is cooked and eaten, it has the same effect as the clothes with no abnormal signs but is perfectly safe. Note, many of them could cause thunderstorms. The sheep that had the evolution splinter did something unexpected. Instead of devolving into another less evolved species of sheep, like a wild one, it instead evolved. Instead of a wild sheep, before humans domesticated them, there stood a much larger, leaner, smarter, and more muscular sheep. I almost thought it was a wolf or I had gone into the wrong room, but it was the same one. Its legs grew longer, and it had a bigger chest and a predator-like body structure. Its wool was like regular hair, its eyes gingerly moved somewhat to the front of the face, its hooves split into 3 toe-like claws, and its horns now grew up before curving and shooting straight out. After briefly observing it, I almost assumed it was turned into a carnivore. But after feeding, I found it to be an herbivore still. When approached, it acted much more aggressively than an ordinary sheep that would act curious or scared. When the wool was sheared, it worked like hair and came off piece by piece. When the meat was eaten, it was extremely tough and gamey. Note, it reminds me of an old anime my mom and I watched as a kid. I was genuinely baffled about how and why this happened, and then I found out why. When I gave both sheep a physical exam, I discovered they were both under a lot of stress. I guess the move from an open field to an enclosed lab, coupled with the lack of noise and social interactions between their kind, set the stress level to skyrocket. That's when I realized what the radiation had done. Due to its stress, the radiation caused it to evolve into something that could handle stress more efficiently in a predator-heavy environment. That's why it looks and acts more aggressively, unlike a predator. So, any external forces could cause a significant change in the subject's situation. That's why the pigeons turned into dodo. They were so calm and in a predator-free and food-rich environment that they devolved into something more suited for such a lifestyle. I can only guess what else it could do. Okay, so I have a dilemma or situation, however you want to see it. While I was testing and observing the sheep, the semi-intelligent octopus snuck out of its aquarium and stole the quirk, Splinter. When I finally found where it was when it was his feeding time, I had to act fast. But the fastest I could go was 2 hours, since it took me a full hour to get him out of his tanks and then another hour to pry it from his tentacles. Who knows how long he had it? Luckily, he didn't turn into a giant monster octopus as I had thought. He just grew smarter, way smarter. The way I found this out was when I came in the next day, and he was sitting at my desk in a glass bowl filled with water and typing on my computer from text to speech. Does he want to work for the facility? I'm not sure why, but I didn't deny him that. I'll have to set something up with him, the chicken, and the professor. He understands human speech and can't speak it, much like the chicken. I guess they'll be my future co-workers. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya, signing off for now. Note, they both have given themselves names. The chicken has called herself Dr. Cluck Orpington, and the octopus has called herself Professor Otto Cephalopod. CH11, co-workers, okay, I'm sorry. Can you run this by me one more time? Egon asked his employee as he took off his glasses to wash his eyes. Sitting in front of the professor were two animals sitting in their chairs. The first was a white leghorn hen with a brain so massive it looked like it would belong to an overly sarcastic portrayal of a super genius. The second was a male Atlantic giant octopus who looked normal but was holding itself up on its right tentacle. Both animals were hooked up to a large machine that had something connected to their heads. According to Izuku, he made a translator for them since they couldn't speak. After taking a breath and putting his glasses back on, he laced his fingers, put his chin on them, and started, "You did experiments on animals?" "Yep," Izuku replied. "You used a chicken and octopus, respectively," Egon continued. "Yep," Izuku confirmed. During which, they both gained human-level thought and understanding. He motions to the two animals. "They do," Izuku admitted. "And now they look for employment, here?" Egon asked while pointing to his desk with both hands. "Yes, yes," as if the boy just didn't get through explaining that the first time around, Dr. Orpington chuckled through the translator. "Hush. It's a lot to take in all at once," Professor Cephalopod barked at her through the machine. Egon looked at Izuku and said, "I think I should start watching over your experiments." Dr. Orpington squawked and argued, "If anything, you should be giving him more freedom. Why has it taken him just a month and a half to find out perhaps one of the many secrets to evolution and quirks as a whole?" Egon sighs and tells her, "Normally, I would be and should be. But I just can't get over you two and your desires." "What's so strange?" Professor Cephalopod asked back. "You want to work here, for us, at this very facility?" Egon firmly asked them. "Were we not clear?" Dr. Orpington asked back, a bit irritated. Egon shakes his head and admits, "I just don't get it." Professor Cephalopod argued, "What's not to get? You need workers, and we want to work. If anything, we crave it," Dr. Orpington excitedly exclaimed. "Yeah, but you're animals," Egon begrudgingly told them. "So are you," stated Professor Cephalopod. Getting a bit irritated yet still holding his nerves, he argues, "No, well yes, that's not what I'm trying to get at here. I'm just saying that it seems kind, cruel." "How so?" Dr. Orpington asked. Deep in thought, Egon pushes away his hair before trying to explain, "Look, you're both animals, so you don't have rights like we do. You're not like us. We think like you, Professor Cephalopod states. That's different, Egon yells while slamming his hand on his desk, finally losing his cool and causing the two animals and teens to jump. Calming himself down and leaning back in his chair, he sips his cold coffee before explaining, "Look, I don't want to say no, but we as a species have had our higher intelligence for the past few 100,000 years. You two gained it through external means just a few days ago. The rules aren't going to just change for you two, trust me on that." "What are you trying to say?" inquisitively asked Professor Cephalopod. Egon sighs, fearing having to explain this, and tells them, "We bought you, made you live here, and did experiments that heightened your awareness. We own you. And now you're saying you want to work for us. How am I supposed to pay you?" "Shrimp and corn. What would two animals, with no concept of money, even want with it? To me, it seems more like servitude, animal cruelty even. You'd have to live here full time, and that just doesn't seem right." "So you're concerned about the morality of the situation?" Professor Cephalopod inquired. The two creatures looked at one another and smiled or something similar, and Dr. Orpington spoke on behalf of both of them. "You truly are a good man, Professor. Also, I'm not sure if you're aware, but you two have stupidly short lifespans," Egon admits to them with an uncomfortable expression on his face. "Doctor, you'll only live about 10 years if you're lucky. And, Professor, you'll live for only half of that. And if you mate, forget it. Plus, you both are already adults of your respective species, so you don't have much time." He tells them in a serious tone. Izuku spoke out once again and informed him, "Actually, I did some tests, and it turns out that in addition to their intelligence being more human, they also have similar lifespans." Egon blinks, his body posture becoming calmer as he says while pointing at the professor, "Well, that solves that problem, but no sec for you." "I will restrain myself," the professor agreed, doing a mock salute. "As for our payment, food and boarding are nice, but perhaps we can use the company funds for our interest from time to time." Dr. Orpington offered. Egon took out a paper and pen from his messy desk and wrote down his thoughts. He told her, "That does sound like a good trade-off, but if you two want to buy something, you'll have to bring it up with me first, and I'll give the green or red light on it." "That sounds perfectly fair," she agrees alongside the professor's offer. Egon then looks up from his writing and tells them, "Just one other thing. Respectfully, neither of you is a doctor or professor." "Well, you're not a professor, Dr. Egon," Professor Cephalopod gurgles a laugh while vexing him. Professor rolls off the tongue better. Egon pouts before wiping a hand across his face and telling them, Fine, just do some online courses in your free time." The two agree, and Egon shakes a wing and tentacle while saying, "Welcome to the team." Ch12, a little big problem one day. Izuku knocked lightly on Professor Egon's door in the research facility. He heard the knock. And judging by the sound of it, whatever Izuku had to tell him wasn't good. So he waited until he came in. "Hey, Professor," Izuku called while opening the door. "Yeah," Egon called back, face deep in paperwork. Izuku slid inside, fidgeted uncomfortably, and said, Figure out how to make the splinters into permanent evolution and devolution ones. I also discovered that when two creatures of the same or very similar species are brought in together, in terms of DNA, and used as a catalyst, it will cause that creature to evolve into the provided DNA structure." Almost instantly, his worries dissolved, and he exclaimed in zeal, "That's amazing. How do you figure it out?" Izuku looked away and fidgeted once more. Egon felt his excitement fade, and he asked, "How do you figure it out?" Izuku looked over to the side while smiling nervously. Egon sat up and exclaimed, his excitement replaced with worry as he firmly asked, "Izuku, what did you do?" Before he could force himself to answer, the answer pushed itself through the door, and Izuku had to hold it back quickly. Egon was so shocked by what he saw that he almost passed out right there. After calming himself down, he looked at his coffee mug and poured it into a nearby plant. "Please tell me the caffeine is getting to me," Egon begged, as Izuku answered with a head shake. Egon puts the mug down, takes a deep breath, and says, "Okay. From what you've just told me, I have 2 questions. Question number 1, he then explodes as he yells them instantly calm down, where did you get a baby elephant? And question 2, he explodes again, but more in a self-agonizing way as he demands, how did you get mammoth DNA? Izuku scratches his head as he holds the baby mammoth by its trunk and explains, I called up a paleontology research facility, and they happen to have a lot of mammoth bone bits that they used for carbon dating. I convinced them, and they managed to give me one. He then looks away while rubbing his head as the baby scks his fingers. He finally explains, as for how I got a baby elephant. Yes, Egon firmly prompts him. I bought it off the black market. Izuku said quickly while hunching into himself. You what? Egon yells so loudly that he knocks himself over and falls to the floor. I paid out of my own pocket with cash. Izuku tried to reassure him quickly. Egon jumps from the floor and bolts at Izuku. Grabbing his shoulders, he exclaimed to his face, that's not what I'm angry about. You went on what I can only hope to be an illegal website with a throwaway computer and purchased a nearly extinct species of animal. Behind my back. Are you out of your mind? Izuku tried to open his mouth, but the words got caught as Egon continued his scolding. What if you got scammed or hacked or killed or something even worse? Izuku looked away, and Egon forced his head to look at him, to which he stated, Izuku, listen to me, and listen to me very carefully. I am all for taking risks and getting messy in the name of science and for the good of its community. But you must know that there is a line that you mustn't cross, and what you did today just showed that you crossed it. On the verge of tears, Izuku whimpered, I'm sorry. Egon pulled away from the frightened boy and told him seriously, science, creation, and discovery aren't all about what you can do, but whether or not you should do it. That's what separates scientists from mad scientists. I'm sorry, Izuku squeaked out once more, trying to hold it all back. For your sake, I really hope you are. Egon told him while sitting back in his chair and letting out a stressed breath. After they both calmed down, anyway, at the end of the day, you did bring back an extinct species into the modern era. Something that the greatest minds have failed to do for centuries. I must commemorate you for that, but we speak nothing of this to the public. They are not ready, and neither are we. Izuku nods in agreement as Egon follows up. Also, why did it have to be a mammoth? You couldn't have chosen to revive something a bit less dangerous. Izuku blinks, then kists off on his fingers. Would you have preferred I revived the giant killer toothed tiger, the giant killer sloth, the giant killer rhino, the giant killer bird that runs, the giant killer bird that flies, the giant killer pig, the giant killer hyena, the giant killer lion, the giant killer bear, or the giant killer dash? Egon cut him off and half yelled, okay. I get it. You chose the least bad option and the only one you would have easy availability for, but don't do this again. Izuku quickly nodded while looking at the ground in shame. Egon then went to his phone and dialed a number while telling the teen, I'll call Uraraka Construction Co. to make an enclosure for it. I'm placing you in full charge of its responsibility and care. As he told Izuku this, the baby mammoth began chewing on one of the decorative plants and knocked over a huge stack of papers that did not even entertain the professor. Yes, sir. Izuku quickly agreed, heading the baby mammoth out of the room and closing the door. Once gone, Egon held the phone against his ear and shoulder while rubbing his temples and saying to him as the phone rang, that kid needs to stop getting so excited and jumping headfirst into things. He's got a head on his shoulders, he should use it. He is seriously going to hurt himself someday. CH13, a new discovery. Professor Egon sat at his desk with Dr. Orpington sitting across from him as she showed off her newest invention. A proud look on her beak. A rocket launcher of sorts that looked like it came straight out of a cartoon with bright colors and funny chicken stickers. He looks between the hyper-intelligent bird and the weapon before taking off his thick glasses to rub his eyes. Okay, so run this by me again. You made what? Egon asks after putting his glasses back in his face. An egg cannon. The doctor told him, using her new, smaller translator which was wrapped around her massive brain. Why? Egon prompted her. For shooting eggs, of course. The doctor explained. What purpose does this serve? Egon asks back. No purpose. It's just fun. Work can't be work all the time. Dr. Orpington told him with a chipper cluck. Okay, but making this doesn't bother you? Egon asked with a cautious and worried tone. Not really. She admitted. You a chicken making a cannon that shoots eggs? Egon asked while motioning to the device with all his fingers. Yes. She replied happily. Egon shook his head, seeing that she wasn't getting what he was implying. So he told her more forwardly, okay, so this is the equivalent of me making a baby cannon. Well, that wouldn't be efficient at all, the doctor said back, making Egon raise an eyebrow until she followed up, saying nonchalantly, besides, you'd have to wait 9 months to reload. Doctor, Egon half yelled at her in disgust and shock. What? She exclaimed back. It's wrong. You're using your unfertilized children as ammunition and blasting them at terminal velocity. Doesn't that bother you? He told her bluntly. She shook her head and replied, no more than you eating my uncooked children does. Egon stopped as he was halfway to his mouth with a breakfast egg sandwich. Placing it down, he said aloud, sometimes I forget that chickens are psychopathic, homicidal, cannibalistic omnivores. The doctor said nothing to him in reply and simply stared, making the professor relent and say, fine, I'll allow it, but no fertilized one. Got it. Understood, she agreed while hopping on a strange machine. It looked like a waiter cart but was heavily modified and metal. It had a steering mechanism for the doctor to drive around using her feet and 2 robotic arms that she could control with a touchpad using her beak. The 2 robotic arms grabbed the egg cannon and placed it on the cart before she maneuvered the machine out of the room. Just before leaving, she nearly bumped into Izuku as he walked in and warmly greeted, Dr. Izuku. Dr. Orpington, Izuku greeted her back before the two went on their ways. Standing in the doorway and knocking on the frame, Izuku asked, Professor, are you busy? No, come in, Izuku. Egon waved the boy in, motioning to a seat. Once he sat down, Egon laced his fingers and asked, so what horrors have you breathed today? Izuku was shocked by the allegation and tried to argue, I didn't dash. Only for Egon to chuckle and tell him, I'm just messing with you. But before you tell me what it is, I have some questions. Izuku sat quietly as Egon took a breath and listed off, is it dangerous, alive, sentient, or potentially world-ending? No. Izuku answered back. Did you do anything dirty, underhanded, illegal, or behind my back? Egon gave him a look. No. Izuku exclaimed back, a bit irritated and hurt. Egon sat back, smiled, and told him, then all of my concerns have been satisfied. What did you make or do, and don't leave out any? He stopped himself after remembering what he had been told the last time he asked that, so he backtracked and told him, on second thought, just give me the main points. Izuku nods before taking out his notebook and exclaiming excitedly, okay, so I was doing some tests on the empty splinters, and I made a huge discovery. Hearing his excitement and seeing his smile, Egon wanted to jump up but opted to simply ask back in equal excitement, what is it, baby? What? So you know how you have all those cell samples from every part of your body, Izuku started. Only for Professor Cephalode, who was walking by with his new translator on his head and a cup of coffee, to overhear their conversation, stop in his tracks, peek his head in, and ask in confusion and concern, samples of what now from every part of your what? Egon shrugged at him and replied, why bother spending money on muscle, skin, and brain stem cells when you get them directly from a self-made source? I wondered why you were covered in so many injuries and scars, the professor commented suspiciously, narrowing his eyes and taking a sip. Izuku then interjected in their conversion and continued, anyhow, I put them all into a vial with a splinter, and you'll never believe what happened. Egon waited for an answer and finally exclaimed, well, don't leave me in suspense. Tell me. It made a copy of your quirk, Izuku finally admitted, only for Egon to fall right out of his chair. Oh, my God. Professor Egon went into cardiac arrest again, Izuku yelled in fear. Again, yelled Dr. Orpington from down the hall. I'll get the defibrillator, Professor Chefload offered while rolling his eyes. I'm okay. I just fell off my seat. Egan shot up an arm from behind his desk to calm their worries. Once he stood back up and breathed, he said he was in disbelief. I don't even know what to say. Are you sure? Izuku produced a splinter from his coat pocket and held it up from the sea. Looking at the splinter, it didn't have the same glowing white effect that a normal one does. More of a prism-bending light shines on it. A fact Egon observed aloud, a different glow. Then, without warning, Izuku gripped the crystal, and from his opposite hand, Izuku produced the same kind of crystal that Egon used to create the splinters. In shock, Egon said nothing except stare until he finally babbled out, "Wait a second. That's my quirk." He looked at the splinter and asked Izuku, "Is this from Dash?" Izuku nodded before he could finish, and Egon sat back in his chair. After polishing the rest of his coffee off, he pushed back his hair and asked, after absorbing that all in, what was different from the BLD and medicine splinters. I even used some of my BLD for the AB splinter, and it didn't show any signs of my quirk. DNA. Pure DNA. Right here, Izuku told him with an excited smile as he pulled out a vial that had a mixed red and blue color in it with bits of white. It took Egon a few minutes to digest what he had just told him. He took the vial and looked it over like a child looking through a kaleidoscope. After a bit, the thought finally dawned on him, and he observed aloud once more, "This is a vial filled with my genetic code." Egon then jumped from his feet, grabbed Izuku in a hug, and spun him around while stating, "Izuku, this is incredible. You just made and discovered the two greatest things in probable history." Izuku couldn't help but feel happy for this and had to resist the urge to cry out in joy with him. But suddenly, Egon stopped his revelry and asked him, while still holding him, "But if you use the DNA samples I collected from my whole body to make the one you have, why do you have this?" he asked while motioning to the veil. Izuku then explained to him, "Well, after I made the splinter with your quirk, I thought, hey, I wonder what happens if I make one with pure DNA that doesn't take the form of anything else in the body. After I figured out how to extract all the DNA, I put it in another splinters, and how about I just show you?" he offered while bringing the professor to a small room in the facility. The room wasn't anything special, there was almost nothing in it apart from a small table with a large and ever-growing crystal on top. Every so often, when it got too big, a set of robotic arms came down from the ceiling and broke off huge pieces of it that fell into a suction vent that scared it into a single corner of the room. In this corner was a machine that would take every individual shard, then cut, shape, and polish it in a uniform before sending it down a short conveyor belt and into a box with many others. After looking over the machines and the box full of crystals ready to be made into empty splinters, he made his way to the ever-growing crystal. Inside the center was a splinter that looked exactly like what Izuku used to demonstrate. Looking at the boy, the man could only say in a low, flabbergasted voice, "Whoa. It's even more potent than this one since the strain was pure," Izuku explained to him with a big smile. "But why make this one?" Egon prompted him. Izuku looked down while shuffling his feet. He explained, "You already do so much for the facility, making every splinter we have. I just thought it would be good to give you a break in at least one regard. And besides, what if you get sick or hurt? And when you die, this place will probably shut down." Egon smiles softly at him, ruffling his hair. He tells him, "Thanks for that, Izuku. You are a good kid with a good heart. Just have to make that head a little less fuzzy," he says this while playfully pinching his nose. Before they could continue this comfortable moment, a shrill voice squealed out of the room, "Dr. Izuku." Both men rushed outside into the main foyer, where they saw three things. Professor Cephalopod leaned on a wall and watched something in amusement as he drank his coffee. Dr. Orpington's cart was knocked over, and the doctor was being chased around the room by the baby mammoth, now called Gammoth, in a one-sided game of chase. "Call off your beast at once," the doctor squealed in urgency as she tried and failed to flap away. "He's just playing with you," Professor Cephalopod called back teasingly. "I'm an adult weighing 13 pounds with hollow bones and a nearly exposed brain. He's a few moments old and already weighs 200 pounds. "He'll kill me," he crowed at him as Izuku ran up and grabbed Gammoth before he could catch her like a child attempting to catch pigeons at the park. Once safely secure, the doctor ruffled her feathers and demanded, "Keep that thing on a leash." Otto just bubbled up a laugh and walked off to his office. Egon helped flip her moving device back up and get out of the foyer while Izuku still had the baby. Once gone, Izuku let go of Gammoth, where he stood by his side. "Izuku," Egon said the boy's name as he walked up to him and said before stopping again, "with this discovery you've made. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? I'll create flyers and social media posts. I'll also separate a small portion of the facility money as an incentive for all volunteers," Professor Cephalopod said from a bit down the hallway, waving a tentacle inside the foyer. "Thank you, Professor," Egon called back before tiling Izuku excitedly. "Now we have a whole new avenue to discover." CH14, Experimental Log, Subject, Quirk Splinter. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting once again with a new round of experiments with the Singularity Soul and, more specifically, the splinters. I'll spare the details since I made them in a different report, directly to Professor Egon, but in short, I was able to extract pure DNA and place it into an empty splinter, thus allowing me to copy a quirk. So far, I have only made a copy of Professor Egon's quirk to produce more splinters. I have also discovered that much like the BLD and medical splinters, when activated with a mental cue, I can produce the quirk as if it were my own. I can put a quirk in a bottle. In a manner of speaking. However, this brings up a new thought. Wouldn't putting a pure extract of a person just make that splinter into said person, just in crystal form? Then why does a person's quirk become the main factor in the splinter? The only theory I could come up with was that a quirk was something entirely different from the rest of the body. Something that lies in DNA but beyond it. And I believe that something to be the soul. Our quirks are internally meshed with our souls, or at least fragments of them. So, in essence, I'm either taking a piece or copying a person's soul with this. However, as you can imagine, that theory has many holes, especially since the Singularity Soul can cause quirks to emerge. So, more tests will have to be done in that regard. After finding and telling about this discovery, Professor Egon, with the help of Professor Cephalopod, was able to do some marketing to get volunteers for this experiment. Luckily, the process was easy. All the volunteers had to do was give their name, age, quirk, and description. Surprisingly, we got over several dozen volunteers. Of course, much of that came from the $100 volunteer award. Either way, we have tons of BLD samples to work with. The only problem is extracting enough DNA to make a pure quirk splinter. I know what and how to do it, but I still need to get it down to a complete science. I'll report back with more results. This is Dr. Izuku Midoriya reporting once again on the quirk splinter creation process. After 2 painstaking weeks of grinding, I finally extracted all the DNA from each BLD sample to infuse into the empty splinters. At that time, I had the process down to science. Now, I just have to make a machine to do it for me. But forgetting about my gripes, I made an accidental discovery during one of my sleepless nights. When placing DNA into one of the vials I use for the absorption process, I accidentally placed 2 different DNA samples into the same one. 5 days later, a splinter with a perfect combination of both quirks came, making a new one entirely. After looking through my records, I discovered that both DNA samples I used were from twins with different quirks. I did some more tests, and this is what I've found. Quirks are just as much a part of our DNA as hair, skin, and eye color, and, as such, can be used to mix and match into different or strong ones. For example, DNA samples from direct relatives such as twins, siblings, and first cousins can be mixed easily. Samples from parents and children can be mixed but with far less efficiency or just simply strengthen the original quirk. Samples made from strangers or 2 people of the same gender have a 0% success rate of melding together, except for when the quirks in question are very similar. For example, if one person has a quirk that can produce a kerosene gel and another has a quirk that can ignite anything flammable, then the result would be a flame body quirk. As for 2 different quirks, making a completely different quirk, like in the case of the twins, one twin can sprout a pair of wings, and the other can control the wind. Thus, the result is the ability to make and maintain the wings of the air. As for a quirk being mixed between mother and child, imagine the mother having a quirk that produces the chemical compound glycerin, and the child can produce explosions. The result would be the explosion quirk becoming even more powerful than it might already be. From this process, I was able to make hundreds of new splinters. My only other question is whether I can triple the combinations or even take 4, make 2, and then combine those. This will require more testing, so Dr. Izuku Midoriya is signing off for now. CH15, Protection. Thank you for seeing me despite your busy schedule, Professor Egon. Professor Cephalopod thanked his employer as he sat across from his desk. Dr. Orpington was accompanying him. Sitting at his desk, Egon waved him off and graciously told him, "Of course, Professor Cephalopod. Now, what did you want to show me?" Accompanying him were Izuku, who the octopus asked to join in the reveal, and Pete, who was eating out of a food bowl by the edge of his office desk. Otto stood in his seat and explained, "As I'm sure you're very aware, this facility lacks security. Don't get me wrong, cameras, locks, silent alarms, and bulletproof glass are all good. But with what we're doing, we need to be creative about hiding and protecting our assets. Catch them with their breaths down, if you get my meaning," he told him while pacing back and forth and talking like a drill sergeant. Getting tired of the theatrics already, Egon sighs and firmly prompts him, "Yes, yes, just tell me what you've made." The professor hops off his seat and skittles over to an object covered in a sheet he had brought. Grabbing it, he announces while ripping it away, presenting the Mimikyu. An ordinary lockbox made of standard grade metal sat there. The sight of this did not impress either Egon or Izuku, who looked more disappointed and exasperated. "A metal lockbox," Egon observed while shifting his glasses down to glance at the professor. Otto said, "It's much more than that. Go ahead, put something in it." Izuku and Egon looked at one another and shrugged. Izuku picked up the empty food bowl from Pete. Bringing the bowl over as the dodo honked in disapproval, the box suddenly sprang open. A mass of teeth and a long tongue snagged it up and swallowed it whole. After liking its lid, it burped. "Whoa!" cried Izuku as he whipped his hand away. Egon sprang from his seat and scooped up Izuku, pulling him out of the perceived danger while Pete honked in fear and ran under Egon's desk. "It's alive," he yelled before realizing and asking Otto in a small voice, "It's alive," to which he nodded. "How did you make this?" Izuku asks as he hides in the living box from behind Egon. "I mutated a Caulerpa taxifolia with human flesh alongside several different quirk splinters that have been made recently by yours truly," he explained with his ego showing. "What a blowhard," Dr. Orpington commented with an eye roll. Upon which a large flesh-like mass with teeth and eyes where they shouldn't be was born with a subconscious similar to that of a cat. "I placed it in that lockbox as a means of temporary holding, but it seems to have bonded and made the box a part of its body. After a few more tests and experiments, the Mimikyu was born," he explained further in excitement and self-pride. Egon looks between the octopus and the box and back to the octopus as he asks, "Okay, but how are we to use this thing?" Professor Cephalopod smiled with his eyes and told him, "I'm glad you asked. So long as the Mimikyu has a record of your scent, it will be completely docile. Anyone else will be ripped to shreds. It's the perfect tool to keep things we don't have the best confidence in and protect them by employing modern security science." "How much can it hold?" Izuku inquired. "As much as the box it inhabits," the professor answered. "Can it change boxes?" asked Egon. "I'm not sure about that. The object it inhabits becomes no different than the shell of a turtle," the professor said. "How can we get things out of it, and won't it just eat anything given?" Izuku inquired again. The professor then tells him, so long as it isn't organic, the Mimikyu can't digest it, which makes it a great organic waste disposal method. It can even safely dispose of radiation. As for how to get things out of it, I implanted it with a form of suggestive telepathy. So long as you think of the item in question, it will give it to you. So long as you know it's there." He then walked up to the Mimikyu and said, "Observe." Professor Cephalopod then holds out one of his tentacles, and the Mimikyu opens up while using its tongue to place a tightly sealed bag of fresh shrimp into said tentacle. To prove his point further, the professor then opens the new bag and begins to eat one shrimp after the other, much to the mixed amazement and disgust of all parties present. How do we care for it? Egon wonders aloud. Professor Cephalopod explains, it only needs a cup of water every month, a consistent temperature, and something that's considered sunlight. Apart from that, it could go years without a meal. But it does eat meat primarily. Egon sits back at his desk, removes his glasses, and rubs his eyes before breathing heavily. He sits there thinking for a while before placing his glasses back on, lacing his finger, and telling the octopus, "Okay, Professor. Stop whatever you're doing and mass-produce these things in different sizes." As he nods, a thought crosses his mind, and just before the meeting ends, he says, "Ah yes, there is one more thing." Grabbing the man's attention, he tells him, if attempting to maul their enemies to bits doesn't work, they have another defense mechanism. Egon raises an eyebrow, then thinks aloud, "From what you've told me, I can only guess that the Mimi in Mimikyu is for its connection to the Mimic in D&D. But what about the cutie part? That must be its other defense mechanism." Professor Cephalopod nods and waves for him to follow while taking the Mimikyu away in a trolley. Izuku and Egon look at one another, shrug, and follow the invertebrate out. After that, they were taken to a testing chamber where the Mimikyu was placed at the center, and all the doctors and professors were safely standing behind the protective observation room. Professor Cephalopod brought out a shabby-looking robot, and after getting inside the observation room with them, he used a remote controller to make the robot walk over to the Mimikyu. To which he looked at his co-workers and said with a pompous tone, "Observe." The robot then began beating on top of the container, and the Mimikyu started to rustle and hiss. When it didn't stop, the Mimikyu jumped back and produced a set of long human legs wearing kitten-heel boots and fishnet stockings. Professor Cephalopod smiles with his eyes and asks, "Impressive, no?" Egon and Izuku stood there, mouths open in shock, while Dr. Orpington glared at her companion with narrowed eyes. After the initial shock washed over, Egon proclaimed, "Impressive. That's 2 major awards in a box. How in the world is that supposed to be a defense mechanism?" "Just watch," Otto assured him. Just then, the Mimikyu ran up to the robot like a drunk person and turned to its side. From there, it brought up its leg and began to produce a flurry of rapid kicks so fast that its legs couldn't be seen, and the robot didn't get blasted away during the entire exchange until the last one was he flew to the other end of the testing room. The Mimikyu then got into a low stance and began to spin like a top, closing the distance and catching the robot in a whirlwind of legs. And finally, the Mimikyu jumped into the air and came down feet first, puncturing a huge hole clean through the robot's metal body with both heels. Holy dash, Egon was about to yell a curse word until Izuku cut him off, saying, "Wow. What do you think?" Professor Cephalopod self-assuredly asked in his work. Egon took a few minutes to process what he saw, remove his glasses, and rub his eyes. After that, he told the octopus, "I think it's crazy and just what we need. Like I said before, you have my permission. Just make sure they don't eat anyone by accident." Professor Cephalopod nods with an eye smile and goes to retrieve his creation. He was leaving a flabbergasted Izuku and Egon with an exasperated Dr. Cluck with them. CH16, new hire. "Okay, people and animals. I'm sure you all know why I've called you here today," Egon said while slapping a table in a meeting room where everyone was sitting around. "It's your birthday," Izuku guessed. "No," Egon replied. "It's Christmas," Otto guessed. "No," Egon replied more firmly. "It's the anniversary of your VSCTMY," Cluck asked in a teasing tone. "Are you serious?" Egon irritatedly asked. "You called us here to tone down the crazy things we're making and doing to get the desired results," Izuku guessed while fiddling with his fingers, making everyone tense up. "No, but that is a good point. So long as you guys aren't doing anything illegal or immoral, it won't turn into an end-of-the-world scenario. I don't see any harm in letting you guys do what you want to do," he told them, making everyone sigh before he slapped the table again and exclaimed, "No, why I called you here is about our team, or rather, lack of it. We need to hire more people ASAP. We also need an organizer, receptionist, and secretary just for you. I'm sure you're just chopping at the bit to do some of what we're doing." Cluck counters her off on her feathers in a tempting tone. Egon sighed, rubbing his sore neck, saying, "I can't argue with that, but we need more heads. We have many avenues to cover and only 3 minds to work with. And I can safely say that after a lot of the things that we've made so far and were able to sell, we are far more financially stable enough to have more employees." Otto clapped his tentacles and proclaimed, "Wonderful. Then let's set up some lectures at different universities and see who becomes interested. After all, what we do here would seem completely bogus to the unwise. So it's perfect to weed out the weak." "I'm in complete agreement with you, Professor, but I'll need you and the doctor to step out of this one," Egon tells the 2 animals, who look at him incredulously. "Izuku and I will take the lead on that," he states firmly. "What? Why?" Cluck argues back. "The world isn't going to magically be okay with talking animals overnight. It might cause an uproar or something worse," Izuku tells them in a fake musical tone while wiggling his fingers. "What about that Nezu fella? He's a talking animal that's known to the public." Otto argues with a raised eyebrow ridge. "Principal Nezu is a whole different can of worms," Izuku tells him. "And one we don't have the time to get into," Egon adds firmly. Seeing their unpleasant expressions, Egon sighs and offers, "Look, we'll be the ones going to just about every university in Japan while you 2 will stay here and look up any potential employees and set up interviews." The 2 animals consider this for a while until Otto finally relents and agrees, "Well, that is better than trekking around in the hot sun all day." Cluck just shrugs with her coworker, also not wanting to walk all over the country. Egon nods in approval while saying, in an exhausted tone, "That's good to hear, and now, let's set everything up and get to it. I seriously need a break." Many failed university lectures later, Egon stomps his way out of the emergency exit of a university auditorium. His face is red with a mix of anger and embarrassment, and he practically foams at the mouth. Running behind him is Izuku, with a huge stack of things in his arms. All these things are used as demonstrations and charts and graphs for lectures. That was the 20th auditorium we were laughed out of. Is it me? Is it you? Is what we're doing really that unbelievable? Egon lamented. From a third-person perspective, it kind of does, but at least this one apologized and gave us our money back for wasting our time, Izuku admitted while taking all the objects down and counting a stack of cash he pulled from his pocket. "We've been to every university and college in Japan and not one promising person or a smig of interest from all those $2, half-brained, money-wasting, idiotic lectures. This is hopeless," Egon yelled while dropping to his knees and yelling into the sky. Izuku rubbed his cheek and offered, "Maybe we should have brought the professor or doctor with us. Nothing tells the truth like hyper-intelligent talking animals." "Maybe," Egon admitted while his face was flat on the ground. "Also, we still have one more college. Maybe this one will be a winner," Izuku tried to assure him in a chipper tone. Egon sighed deeply and lamented, giving in, "Then let's get it over with so I can go cry into a tub of ice cream and fried chicken." Later Egon stood before a now empty auditorium with an expression that could only be considered to contain anguish. Beside him was Izuku, who felt like a clown for suggesting one more. After calming down a bit, his eye twitched, and he broke his pointing stick in frustration. After getting that out of his system, he stated, "Well, I guess that's it. What a PSS up." "It could have been worse," Izuku tried to offer. Egon groaned and told him, "Thank you for the optimism, Izuku. But it's not appreciated at the moment." After wiping his hands across his face and making a painful sound, he began to pack his belongings while saying, "Let's go back so I can put myself into a food-based hangover. What happens if you infuse the 2 polarities together? Also, what would happen if you turned the frequency into a baseline instead of positive or negative? Would sound waves have any effect on this? Asked a voice that sounded close to Egon. Thinking it was the boy, Egon repressed the urge to growl and told him, Izuku, I'd love nothing more than to trade theories with you, but right now, dash. That wasn't me, Izuku cut him off swiftly. After hearing this, Egon looked into the empty auditorium one last time. He looked closely, narrowing his eyes and putting a hand over them to see better. After scanning the area, he finally came upon one single person left sitting in the now empty hall. Professor Egon. Did you hear me? The person asked aloud. Going over to his assistant, Egon mouthed to him, I think we found a winner. After this, Egon and Izuku invited the only person left to an impromptu interview outside the college's building. They sat on benches, looking across from one another on a stone table. The person left was a man in his late 30s wearing typical college attire. He was evenly tanned with blue eyes and a mild build with a height of just under 5 feet 3 inches height. His face was angular, and his eyes were tired. On his head was not hair but 5 tube-like attachments that seemed to move independently. 4 of the 5 were very snake-like but had no features apart from a mouth in which the teeth were made into the lips instead of being covered by them. The 5th one was like a tail. Thanks to Izuku, they obtained a large chunk of his background for this interview, and Izuku was given the chance to do the interview. After looking it over briefly, Izuku asked him, So Mr. Hankyo Suru, am I saying that correctly? The man nodded. Well, Mr. Hankyo, I do like what I see so far, though I have a few questions for you, if that's all right. Once again, he nods. After flipping a page, Izuku inquired, I can't help but notice 2 things. First off, you are well into your late 30s and attending college, so there's nothing wrong with that. Education should never be based on age, only those willing to learn. It also says here that you have over a dozen years of experience in the music industry as a singer and performer. What compelled you to take such a drastic shift in career choices? Hankyo blows out the air in a stressed manner before explaining, Where do I start? Well, I'm sure you have no idea who I am, but back when I was a singer, I used to go by the name 5-Chord Gus. Oh, I think I've heard of you. You're from Europe, if I'm not mistaken. I know because I heard your rendition of Oh Mio Babino Caro by Puxinai, if I'm not mistaken. Egon cuts in with recognition. That's me. I used to sing a lot of songs back in my day, Hankyo confirmed as he continued, as for why I choose to pursue a different career choice, especially at this stage of my life, well, I'm sure you know. Still, I'll tell you everything anyway. I want to be completely transparent with you since you're considering hiring me. They look at one another and nod, and Izuku prompts him to continue. After some internal conflict, Hankyo admits, ever since I was young, my quirk 5 living chords gave me full control, range, and frequency of my vocals. I was a natural prodigy at singing. And my parents used this. From when it manifested to the point my career ended, my parents used my talent to make a bank. Every day was always about how I can improve and how I can get even bigger, he said in an irritated and disgusted tone. After breathing to calm himself, he continues saying, anyway, as you can guess, that was a lot of undue stress on a developing child, and my mind was hanging on by a thread for my whole life until I finally snapped. I am not proud of it, but I killed a lot of people on my very last performance day. Several people in the crowd, a few security guards, my manager, and my parents. He stops with a shaky breath and wipes away a stray tear. After calming down enough to speak correctly, he tells them, none of those people deserve to die. Except for my parents and my manager. I'll never deny my feelings on that, he proclaimed boldly, making the 2 men across from him sweat drop. Hankyo coughs and continues with an apology, sorry. I don't remember much of what happened after that, but I managed to get out of any legal trouble by settling outside of court. When my head cleared a bit, I had a recollection of what I did and checked myself into a mental ward. I got out in a year and spent the next few figuring out myself. My entire life, my world revolved around my talent for singing and nothing else. I had to do what most kids have their whole lives to do. That's when I realized I had a knack for discovery and knowledge, but didn't like going outside. So I decided to become a researcher and enrolled in this university. He takes another shaky breath, hugging himself to calm down before babbling, but I'll be honest, my only two regrets in life were killing all those people during my breakdown and never helping my two older siblings. My parents always shunned them, and I was favored up until the oldest turned 18 and moved out with the middle. I never saw them again. I hope they are happier now than when they were with my parents. God, I miss them so much. I wish I could apologize to them. Hankyo realized what he was saying and doing. He retracted while apologetically stating, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Izuku waves it off and tells him, no, no, no. You needed to get that off your chest. Though if I may. Why come to Japan? Izuku inquired. Hankyo shrugs and tells him, just needed to get away from everything. A fresh start, why no? Izuku nods, looks to Egon, then back to Hankyo while asking, could you give us the room? Hankyo nods and walks off to a different spot, allowing the two men to speak semi-privately. From there, Izuku stands and asks his superior, Professor, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Yes, he exclaimed. So you think we should give this guy a chance and hire him? He asked to make sure. But Egon disappointed him as he admitted, I was thinking we should stop by my favorite American restaurant and get some of their new cheese fries, but let's do your thing first. Izuku gives him a half-lidded stare while Egon shoots back, what? I'm hungry. Izuku shakes his head and walks back over to the man who is now making a flower crown. Mr. Hankyo. Izuku started, making the man stand up. The teen then stuck out his hand and smiled, welcome aboard. Once you've graduated, you have a job waiting for you in the Neo Icon Phoenix Research Facility. Hankyo's face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he exclaimed in an excited voice while shaking his hand hard and fast, oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll do my best to make you both proud. You won't regret this, the boy and his head tendrils shaken like crazy. Seeing that Izuku was stuck, Egon broke it up by saying, don't thank us yet, you'll also have the pleasure of running your division. Hankyo stopped shaking and clutched a nearby tree. Looking ready to pass out, he asked, My division. It can be anything you want, Egon tells him. Well then? Hankyo thinks for a minute before offering, how about the sound division? The two men look at one another, shrug, and Egon says, if that's what you want. After many thanks and handshakes, goodbye. Izuku and Egon begin to walk away from the college. Once they're seemingly far enough away, Egon turns to Izuku and asks, should we be worried that the guy who has music-based PTSD wants to make an entire research division solely to the study of sound? Let's put a pin in it for now, Izuku tells him with equal concern. To which Izuku asks, should we have told him about his other co-workers? Egon thinks about it, mentally rejects it, and replies, let's cross that bridge when we arrive. Speaking of which, I wonder how they did on their manhunt. Later, at Neo Icon Phoenix Research Lab, you found and set up how many? Egon exclaimed in shock as he looked over his two animal employees. 6 in total. That includes your assistant, secretary, and organizer. Professor Cephalopod answered while adding sugar to his coffee cup. As Egon stands in shock, Izuku does quick math and corrects him, your math is off. It would be 8, not 6. You'll see what I mean at the interviews, Professor Cephalopod says vaguely with a knowing look, making Izuku more concerned than curious. So, how did your search go? Dr. Orpington asked, pecking at a loaf of bread. Like SHT, Egon groaned while rolling his eyes. We did find one. Izuku corrects him. Wow. Professor Cephalopod resists the urge to chuckle while Dr. Orpington holds no bars back and clucks out loud in laughter. Hey! Don't laugh. We were kicked, laughed at, and chased out by many of those uptight universities. We were lucky to get just one. Egon sumps at the two creatures. After sighing in frustration, he states, anyhow, let's hope these 6 people meet our criteria during the interviews. Headhunting is harder than it looks. CH17, interview. Over the past 2 weeks, Egon and Izuku were able to interview every last person set up by Professor Cephalopod and Dr. Orpington. Each person came on a different day, and the interviewer changed from Izuku to Egon when one of them wasn't busy. Rarely was it to have both, and like before, Egon told Cephalopod and Orpington to take a back seat on this one, much to their dismay. The first person they interviewed was an older Japanese woman with short black hair, a muscular yet chunky body, and a blue eye with one covered in an eye patch. Today's interview was Izuku, who skimmed through her background and resume. "So, Ms. Kobayashicho, it says you're 40 years old?" he asked as the woman nodded. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I'm not judging you because of your age. I'm just curious why you would be looking for a new job," Izuku assured her, already thinking about the worst-case scenario with his question. She thought for a minute, then explained, "Well, I felt like I needed a change of pace, and retired life just wasn't cutting it for me. It's more something to keep me busy. As I am sure you saw, I have several degrees in manufacturing, construction, and research." Izuku confirmed with a nod and, glancing at her resume, said, "I did. So what exactly did you do for work before this?" "I was a decorated war veteran, Purple Heart," she told him nonchalantly. "War veteran," Izuku exclaimed while nearly falling out of his seat. Cho then took out a few items from her bag and placed them in front of him. The first was a picture of her in full uniform and covered in medals. The next was a Purple Heart certificate. Izuku had to blink several times to ensure he saw this correctly. "I lost my eye because I helped in the Battle of Criss-Crossing by hot wiring the enemy tank and using it against them. That's when I lost my eye. I was able to bring the battle machine back, take it apart, see how it was made, and draw up schematics for us to use." She spun her short tale with a nostalgic tone. "That's incredible," Izuku exclaimed while pushing his hair back. He then stood up and saluted her, stating, "Well, allow me to say thank you for your services, and you're hired." Cho stood up with a smile and saluted him back. A few days later, Egon was interviewing the next person who came. A tall, scruffy, and scrappy man with pink hair and golden eyes, covered in grease and oil with many tears in his clothing. In short, he did not look ready for an interview. His smile was immense and proud, his excitement palpable, his eyes alert or eye. Since he only had one, and the other with a small portion of his face was covered up in a mechanical replacement. Wary of him, Egon looked through his background check and resume. After some thought, he broached the topic, asking, "Mr. Hatsume, it says here you had some problematic behavior with your other workplace. Care to explain your side of the story?" He smiled while proudly pointing a thumb at himself and explaining, "Yes. I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I consider myself somewhat of an out-of-the-box genius." "Go on," Egon prompted him. "So I like to do things and test things that others don't or won't do. So that got me into a lot of trouble," he continues. "I see," Egon confirms. He then sighs while shrugging and says, "So they fired me. But whatever I did, I got results, even if they exploded 3 or 10 times. That's also how I replaced one of my eyes." Egon replied while narrowing his eyes. "If you are still not convinced, allow me to show you one of my inventions," he offered, taking something from inside his overalls and placing it on the table while exclaiming, "Ta da." Egon narrows his eyes as he observes aloud, a toy sci-fi gun. In front of him was what looked like a plastic ray gun, painted and decorated with stickers to make it appealing to children. Hatsume giggles and tells him, "That's just to make it appear less threatening. Allow me to demonstrate." He then pointed the toy at a small potted plant and shot. A beam came out, grabbed the plant, and pulled it right to his hand. The only thing Egon could say was, "Wow." "It's a tractor beam," Hatsume said in a sing-song tone before things went wrong. As soon as the plant reached him, several other random things started to shift before flying at him and attaching to his body alongside Egon, who was pulled right out of his seat. From there, he was pressed front to front with Hatsume, nose to nose, in a very awkward position. The two of them looked at one another for a long while before saying, in a coy tone, "Oh, sir, I didn't know you cared. Turn it off," Egon growled at him. He flicked the off switch, and all the attracted items, including Egon, finally fell or broke away. Egon grunts at him, and Hatsum chuckles nervously, it might still have a few bugs. After straightening out his lab coat and fixing his glasses, he tells the man, "If we hire you, then you'll have to be monitored, not interact with others while working, and be placed in a highly secure room so you don't cause too much destruction." "Sounds perfect to me," Hatsum answered in zeal. After brushing himself off, Egon extended his hand and said, "Well, welcome aboard, Mr. Hatsum. Please don't make me regret this decision," he told him in a flat tone as Hatsum shook his hand excitedly. A week after that, the next newcomer came and was interviewed by Izuku. Once again, with a background check and resume on hand, he looked over everything she had and liked what he had seen so far. The interviewee was a young woman in her mid-20s with long, straight blonde hair, green eyes, a mix of yellow and pink accessories, and glasses, and appeared to be mixed Japanese and Spanish. She seemed to be very excitable and always had a bright smile on her face the whole time. Before Izuku's could say anything, the woman joyfully said, "First of all, I'd just like to thank you for giving me this opportunity, sir." "Thank you for coming out here, Ms. Aiko Miyazaki," Izuku replied, making sure to pronounce her name correctly. She giggles and waves her hand, offering, "Oh please, call me Honey Lemon. All my friends do." "Well, Honey Lemon, I like what I see so far. You have many degrees and credentials to go with it," Izuku complimented her as he reviewed her resume. "Thank you. I worked very hard to get them," Honey Lemon said with a proud smile. "I'd just like to ask Izuku began before she suddenly cut in again. "Oh. And if you're unsure about my abilities, I bought something to show you." "Do you have anything made of metal?" she asked while digging through her enormous shoulder bag. Izuku was unsure but allowed curiosity to take over, and he went to his comlink. Talking over, he called into the facility, "Can someone bring me something made of metal we don't need?" He then pushed the speaker button again and stated firmly, and not a mimicry this time, "Please." A few minutes later, an in-process robot created by Dr. Orpington walked in with a metal sheet. Once it stood the solid piece up, it left, and Honey Lemon finally found what she was searching for. She jumped to the metal sheet and began to spray it with something that came out of a pink-colored spray bottle. After several sprays, it left a pink mist hanging all around it. From there, she pulled out another device that electricity charged the air around the mist and instantly turned the metal slab pink. "Ta-da!" Honey Lemon proclaimed. "So, pink," Izuku observed while trying not to sound unimpressed. She chuckled excitedly and said in a sing-song tone, "Here's the best part." She then walked up to the pink metal and touched it with only her index finger. Right away, the sheet seemed to explode in a pink cloud all around them. Some of it was dusting Izuku's face, hair, and coat. "Whoa," was the only thing he could say in amazement. "I know, right? Chemical metal embrittlement," Honey Lemon exclaimed in zeal as she took over her pink-colored glasses and tried to brush off her pink outfit. Izuku quickly dusts himself off. Sticking out his hand, he tells her, "Well, Honey Lemon, you're hired." Honey Lemon squealed in delight and began to rapidly shake Izuku's hand while half yelling, "Oh thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." She quickly realized how hard and rough she was shaking him and stopped while apologetically saying, "Oh, I'm sorry." The next day, Egon took up the following interview and was met with a man whose features were hard to pin down since several parts of him kept changing to different animals. The only constants were his green eyes and brown hair. Looking at his record and resume, Egon inquired, "Mr. Anima Genus, it says on your resume that you were a zoologist. Why come to work here?" Genus looked like he was resisting the urge to roll his eyes as he explained, "My previous work had me only studying animals and their environments, behavior, and nothing else. I wanted to try and find a new way to help animals adjust to new environments and bolster the population. Not dig through rhino dung to study their diet. I thought about changing my career choices for that, and here I am." I can understand your frustration. Egon sympathizes with the man before looking and thinking things over before saying, well, consider yourself hired. 2 days after that, both Izuku and Egon were able to collaborate on the following interview. With the information in hand, the two men stood across from their next potential employee. It was a short, stout woman of African descent. Her skin was colored like soil, freckles decorated her cheeks, and her hair was a giant blush shaped like an afro. Egon was the first to start by saying, "Mrs. Pamela Hollyhock, I'm a bit concerned with what I found out about you." She raised an eyebrow as he continued and asked her, "You created a literal monster Venus flytrap, and it ate 3 people. Care to explain that?" She huffed at that, then answered, "Well, honey, back when I worked at the Tokyo Botanical Research Facility, I had told my co-workers not to come into one of the greenhouses for a while as I was working on a special self-made assignment. I took it up with the whole chain of commands, and they okayed it. But a couple of yahoos tried to sneak in to steal it to take credit. And you can guess what happened after. So I had to take the blame and got canned." Izuku whistles in shock and amazement and says, "Woof. What a deal breaker. I hate it when companies do nothing to protect their employees from the prospect of saving face." Hollyhock nods in reply. Izuku then goes off track and says, "I can't say that those people deserved it, but if you get killed by a stationary plant, then at that point, it's natural selection." He looks at Egon, and he shrugs nonchalantly. Hollyhock hums and agrees, "I hear ya, honey. I do have one more concern to bring up, your hair. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just, well, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that a work environment like this has many dangers, including machinery and chemicals. I wouldn't want you to get hurt." Egon attempted to tell her as nicely as he could. She smiles and assures him with a wave, "Not to worry, sweetie. I can control all plant life." With a twitch of her head, her afro sinks and morphs into long braid-like veins. She then wiggles her index finger, and the potted plant on Egon's desk grows so large and fast that it breaks its pot, sprouts, and cuts white flowers. The two men watch this in awe before looking at one another in amazement, then back to her, where Egon proclaims, "Wow. Well, you're hired." On the last day of the 2 weeks, Egon took hold of the previous interview and needed clarification going in. It was an interview for one, but there were 3 different jobs. Was one person trying to do 3 jobs? It made no sense, and Professor Cephalopod, who set it up, could have been more helpful in explaining it and just being vague with a knowing and entertained glance. When he got to his office, he was even more confused when 3 identical people beset him. They were all females in their 30s, tall and thin, with blue eyes and black hair. They were all wearing the same clothes, and in fact, they all looked exactly like one another, apart from their hairstyle. The one on the right had long hair in curls at the ends. The one in the middle had medium hair in ringlets. The one on the left had short hair that was sideswept. Upon seeing Egon, all 3 girls got up and bowed deeply to him, saying in scary unison, "Greetings, sir." Egon was taken aback and didn't know how to reply, which gave the girls more than enough time to introduce themselves. "I'm Morgan," said the girl with long hair. "I'm Megan," said the girl with medium hair. "And I'm Millicent," said the girl with short hair. Egon noted how all their voices sounded the same. After adjusting himself to the uncomfortableness, he greeted them and asked, "Nice to meet you girls as well. So you're all looking to become my organizer, secretary, and receptionist, right?" He then looked down at his hands that held their resumes and observed aloud, "But you only gave me 1 resume. Why is that?" "We are 1 person," all 3 answered in unison. Egon raised an eyebrow and asked, "Sorry. What do you mean?" The 3 girls closed their eyes and began vibrating faster until they became 3 blurry images. The 3 melded into one, and after the vibrating stopped, there stood a appealing woman like the 3 girls before. She had the same face, eyes, and everything else apart from her long, straight hair. The woman bowed and greeted in the same voice, but with a different tone, "Hello, sir. My name is Morgan Layful. My quirk allows me to split my body and consciousness in 3 ways. I've done this so often that my other personalities do not like being in one body for too long. Egon blinks a few times and replies, "This makes a lot more sense." After adjusting himself, he tells the woman, "While I understand the fact you are 3 people with one body, by law, I can only pay you 1 salary." That was to be expected, Morgan agreed with a nod. Egon looked over her resume, and after a bit of thought, he said, "Well, I like what I see in your resume. So you're hired." Egon looked up from the paper only to see the 3 girls again, speaking in unison, "Thank you very much, sir." Egon had to repress the urge to freak out. Instead, he forcefully blew out air to stay calm as he muttered, "That's gonna need some getting used to." After the 2 weeks had ended, Egon called for all the interviewees to attend a meeting at the facility a few days later on their first official day of work. Everyone had gathered in the front entry loft, where talk was abuzz in the area as everyone got to know one another. However, the conversation quickly subsided when Egon and Izuku entered the room. Everyone, please gather around," Egon called as everyone present formed a circle around the 2 men. Egon cleared his throat and announced, "As the owner and operator of the Neo-Icon Phinox Research Laboratory, I would just like to be the first to say welcome and congratulations. It is a pleasure to have each one of you here working with us." Everyone clapped in response, with some jumping for joy, whistling, or laughing. Egon put up his hand, and once quite again, he said, "I expect to see great things and greater achievements from all of you. I hope you can make me proud." "Yes, sir," everyone announced in unison. Egon clapped his hands and stated, "Great to hear. Now, if any of you have questions or concerns regarding anything, please bring it up with me or the Vice President Dr. Midoriya." He motioned to the small boy beside him, who looked like a frightened dog that just got yelled at for pooping inside the house. No hands went up, much to Izuku's relief. Public speaking was never a skill for him. That is until Hollyhock raised her hand. Izuku gulped and steadied himself as he called out, "Yes." She asked the 2 men, "How exactly did you 2 run this place? It's huge and has been in operation for weeks. How do you do it?" The 2 of them looked at one another before smiling as Egon answered, "I'm glad you asked because I was thinking of a way to tell you all that. Before all of you, we had 2 others helping us. They'll be your senior co-workers, and I warned you they are a bit strange." All the people looked at him, confused or like he was crazy, making Egon sweat drop at seeing them not understand. Izuku tugged on his sleeve and offered, "Maybe it would be better if we just showed them." Izuku then went over to the front desk phone and pushed the facility speaker button. He called, "Professor Cephalopod and Dr. Orpington, please come to the main foyer." After putting the phone down, they were all struck by the sound of something very fast speeding down the hallway and moving in their direction. After finding the source, they all stepped away from the hallway as they heard 2 voices yelling at each other. Both were getting closer and closer with each word. "Slow down, you pompous poultry," Professor Cephalopod screamed in fright. "I can't. Your slimy fish bowl fried my controls," Dr. Orpington screamed back at him as she attempted to gain control over her cart. "We're going to crash," the professor yelled as one of the foyer walls zoomed into view. "I'm gonna die," crowed the doctor in terror. Suddenly, the mechanical cart crashed into the wall at top speed, with bits of parts, metal, glass, and water flying all over the place as everyone jumped out of the way, covered themselves up, or watched in a mixture of awe and horror. The last thing to happen in the chaos was a single wheel that rolled out from the wreckage and spun around to stop on the floor in front of them. "What was that?" the Morgana triplets asked in unison. "Your co-workers," Egon drowned. The 2 animals pulled themselves out of the wreckage and stumbled into view. Luckily, it did not seem like they were hurt, the impact just dazed them. Otto was the first to shake out of his stupor and see that all the new employees were looking at them in confusion. Adjusting himself and his translator, he saw his compatriot and tried to get her back into motion. He slapped the doctor on the back and said, "Put yourself to getting penny henny. Our new work associates are here, and you're making us look bad." "My brain feels like pudding," Cluck replied in a dazed tone, with swirls in her eyes. Proceeding trying to help her, he turned around and introduced himself after clearing his throat, "Greetings, everyone. My name is Professor Otto Cephalopod. It's a pleasure to be working together with so many intelligent minds. And the half-dead bird you see is my associate, Dr. Cluck Orpington. He motioned to the chicken that could barely stand on its legs. Suddenly, Cluck shook herself back to consciousness and exclaimed, "Your associate." "I think you mean my associate." Otto rolled his eyes and shot back, "Of course, you'd come out of your stupor for a comment like that." "What's that supposed to mean?" she yelled while getting into his face. "Why don't you use that big head of yours to figure it out, Chicken Little?" he yelled while pushing her back. She growled and yelled, "My head may be big, but at least my brain is smarter than yours, Squidward." Otto curled his tentacles in anger and proclaimed, "I hate how his name and species don't correlate." As the two of them continued to bicker, everyone else stared at the two hyper-intelligent animals in awe, wonder, and confusion. This made Egon slap his face while Izuku smiled and laughed awkwardly. "Talking animals," Hankyo observes aloud. "Cool, Honey Lemon, Hatsum, and Gina speak in unison." "I hope you boys didn't make any talking plants," Hollyhock asks suspiciously. "Not yet," Egon tells her with a sigh, knowing the inevitable. "You could be the first," Izuku jokingly offered. Cho shakes her head and states, "Welp, I've officially seen it all." Hankyo places a hand on her shoulder and tells her, "I get the feeling you're saying that too soon." As he told her this, Pete walked into the room, attracted to all the commotion, and began to peck mindlessly at the destroyed machine. Cho went to open her mouth, but Hankyo tightened his grip, making her look at him, where he solemnly shook his head. Cho understood and dropped it, allowing everything to play out as it was, in chaos. CH-18, Dragon Egon looked over a large sheet of schematics on his much cleaner desk. It was a map of the facility with a detailed outline of all security measures on the premises. Hidden turrets, traps, sensors, Tesla gates, and much more were outlined in the promise of maximum security. After looking it over for quite a while, he fixed his glasses to look up at Dr. Cho's happily excited, smiling face. He cleared his throat and told her nervously, "While I like the schematics you have for an in-facility security system, Dr. Cho, I'm just a bit worried about how should I say this? Extreme and fatal it is. Don't you think it's a bit much?" Cho raised an eyebrow as she leaned in and shot back, "With what we got and are doing here, I'd say it's almost too little. This is honestly the watered-down version of what I originally thought up." "Holy Christ," Egon exclaimed as he thought about the ramifications, watching as Cho said back to glance at him with a smug look. Seeing her point, he told her with a sigh, "Well, I can't argue with that. I'll allow it, if need be, we'll add more later. But add some non-lethal defenses as well. You can't be all gung-ho for every situation. You may commence construction on it." Dr. Cho nods and rolls up the diagrams before leaving the new automatic sliding doors made by Professor Hatsum. Once she left, the doors stayed open as someone else barged in. Egon noticed this, looked up from his desk, and saw Izuku. He was red in the face, shaking like a leaf, and 2 seconds from crying. Egon sighed lightly and said, "Oh boy." "Yes, Izuku. What have you done this time?" "I had an accident," he finally admitted through a shaky breath. "I thought you were housebroken," Egon replied with a raised eyebrow. "Professor," he shouted back in a mix of panic and anger. Egon raised his hands and, in a calm tone, told him, "I'm just teasing." "What's bugging you so badly?" Izuku sniffs back his emotions and steadies his voice as he answers, "I was dabbling around with the evolution and quirk splinters, and I made something I had no intention of making." Egon waits for the rest, but when it doesn't come, he prompts him firmly, "Well, don't leave me in suspense. Tell me what it is." Izuku walked up to his desk on shaky legs, his emotions just moments from spilling over as fear gripped his heart at how his boss would react to his newest blunder. He reached into his coat and brought out a small creature cupped in his hands, showing it to the man reluctantly. "Here," he said with a quiver. Egon looked down at the little creature, adjusting his glasses, seeming to be nothing but an oddly colored lizard. He chuckled at what Izuku was so scared about showing him and proclaimed, "Is that it? This teeny tiny little lizard is all that you made?" I was expecting something far more. He trailed off as the small lizard took a mammalian gait, sprouted a set of tiny wings, and breathed out a puff of smoky fire. Dangerous, he said in confusion. He looked at the boy who was begging to shake and cry while asking him calmly, "Izuku, did you make a dash?" The boy broke down into tears, hunching over and covering his face as he wailed, "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize it would happen." Egon was shocked by his reaction and almost froze. Luckily, he kept himself together and placed the baby dragon on his desk while he tended to the terrified, crying boy. Holding his shoulders and petting his head, he told him, okay, let's calm down for a moment. I'm not mad, just surprised. It's not like you tried to hide this from me until it got out of hand or did it behind my back, and you have told me that it was a complete accident. Just give me the rundown of what happened. Why you not mad? Izuku looked up with red eyes and a runny nose. Just surprised, that's all, Egon assures him. Izuku sniffles and gets help cleaning up his face from Egon, who explains, well, after testing and gaining the results of the quirk and evolution splinters, I thought about what would happen if both were used on the same creature. No plant I used would work, so I used an animal instead. And to minimize any damage, I used a small baby creature. He let Izuku breathe and collect himself a bit before he continued, but after 5 minutes, he gently prompted him, go on. So I used the fertilized egg case of a gecko. And when it hatched, this came out. And I came to you as soon as I did, he finally finished. Egon sat back on his butt on the floor and breathed a sigh of relief, which was close enough for the baby dragon to climb onto his head, down his face, over his body, and across his lap before climbing into Izuku. The little lizard crawled up to his neck and cuddled into it. Observing the animal, Egon noticed how different it was from most reptiles at a second glance. Apart from the wings and mammalian gait, it had distinct claws on all 4 of its limbs, a head it held upright, 2 stubs of horns, eyes large enough to be seen from both the side and front, colored a BLD orange to red, and its skin was like a mix of scales and regular skin. Still, it was the standard size for a newly hatched gecko. After he breathed out any stress, he told Izuku in a calm tone, okay, good. I know the details. We can work on finding out more pressing things about this new species, like how big it will grow, what it will eat, what temperament it will have, and so forth. After that, we will decide whether to keep or kill it while it's still young and manageable. There's no need for that, I have just the solution, a voice called from the still open doorway. Both men looked over and said aloud, Professor Cephalopod. What do you mean by that? Izuku asks him. Me and Professor Genus were collaborating. He stared off. That's not good. Egon muttered under his breath. And made this. He finishes by placing a strange splinter at their feet, which seems to change its brightness while changing to many psychedelic colors. Egon held up the strange pulsating splinter and asked, and this is? The professor explained vaguely, this splinter does in days what thousands of years of selective breeding do. Who? Both said at once. The professor rolls his eyes and explains, keep it near any wild thing, and it will become as domestic as a dog in just a few days. Well, at least this solves that specific dilemma of this thing turning on us and into a meal, Izuku stated while admitting the splinter's strange colors. As the 2 men looked at the psychedelic splinter, Otto tried to escape, only for Egon to catch wind of something and shout, hold it right there, calamari boy. Before he could scramble, Egon grabbed the octopus under his eyes and brought him face to face, where he stated, what else? What do you mean? Otto asked back innocently. Egon squeezed him tighter and exclaimed, don't know what do I mean, Remy. My IQ may not be half as high as yours, but I wasn't born yesterday. What else did you and Professor Genus make while collaborating? Giving a nervous laugh and rubbing the back of his head, he admitted, yes, about that. I was going to come to you about something else. What? Egon growled while squeezing him again. After contemplating, the cephalopod tells him, you're going to have to change Gamatha's feeding regimen. Why? To what? Izuku was the one to inquire, being the primary caretaker. An adult amount. Cephalopod tells him while trying to look away and sweating. Izuku looks at him weirdly, and Egon adjusts his grip so the two can speak face to face. Izuku asks further, she's a baby. She won't be an adult for another decade or so. About that, Cephalopod laughs nervously. Egon squeezed him again and snarled, about what? After tapping his tentacles, he tried to say, well. Before he could answer fully, a loud sound, like a trumpet being amplified through a jet engine, sounded through the now closed door. Both men looked at one another when the sound stopped and ran out the automatic door, Cephalopod still in Egon's hand. As they ran, the loud sound rang out once more, and they could follow it right to the front entry foyer, where they saw something that made their jaws drop. A fully grown, woolly mammoth stood before them and ate the decorative plants while Dr. Genus tried to get a hold of it. Meanwhile, Megan, who was operating the desk, looked unfazed at the enormous prehistoric creature eating everything around her. After letting the shock and amazement pass, Egon asked rhetorically, Professor Cephalopod, why is our baby mammoth calf now a full-grown adult mammoth cow? Me and Professor Genus have made several different splinters for population surging. One of which causes any organism to develop rapidly, the professor admitted. Only to be squeezed again, as he asked in a repressed, angry tone, and you tried to hide this from me, why? We needed to run more tests, Otto explained while sweating before he tried to save himself by offering, on the plus side, we made sure to spay her before doing so. Egon gave him a half-lidded look as Izuku informed him, you know that only works on boys, right? The professor turned pale. Egon looked ready to burst a gasket, and even the now fully grown Gammoth could sense it and started to walk away. Izuku stepped back with the baby dragon hiding in his hair, and Genus began to hide behind the desk as Megan tried to make herself look busy. But no furry came, and he calmed himself down with an irritated sigh. He calmly stated, Izuku, you are no longer solely responsible for the care of Gammoth. From now on, Professor Cephalopod and Genus will help as well. Understood. Why yes sir, the octopus and man replied quickly in unison. After placing the octopus on the ground and fixing his hair and glasses, he returned to the facility and said, come along, Izuku. Let's run some tests and diagnostics on a new fire-breathing friend. With that, Izuku followed him to a testing chamber to run tests on the new animal, leaving Cephalopod and Genus to try and round up Gammoth back into her enclosure. Indeed, this was the first of many strange days to come.